At my husband's family barbecue, my sister-in-law made a joke. She looked right at me and said if you disappeared tomorrow, literally no one would even notice. Everyone laughed. Except me. I just raised my hot dog and said challenge accepted. I moved out that night, cut contact, and vanished. A year later, they are the ones who are forgotten now. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family. The summer air in Buckhead was thick with humidity and the smell of expensive smoked meats. My mother-in-law Loretta was hosting her annual summer gathering at her sprawling estate. Women in designer sundresses and men in tailored linen shirts mingled around the infinity pool. I sat quietly at the edge of the patio, picking at my food, observing the performance. My husband Marcus stood by the outdoor bar, laughing loudly, with his white brother-in-law Brad. I was the outsider. I was always the outsider. I was the girl from the working-class side of town who had somehow infiltrated their pristine upper-crust Atlanta family. They never let me forget it. They never let me speak. They never let me exist as anything other than a prop. Valerie, my sister-in-law, tapped her crystal champagne flute with a manicured nail. She was wearing a silk dress she had bought using a credit card I secretly paid off every month. The chatter around the pool died down as everyone turned to look at the golden child. Valerie smiled her perfectly practiced influencer smile, her eyes scanning the crowd before locking dead onto me. She fed on attention. She fed on superiority. She fed on making me feel incredibly small. Honestly, Simone Valerie announced, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the waterfall feature. If you disappeared tomorrow, literally no one in this family, or in all of Atlanta for that matter, would even notice. You are basically wallpaper. The silence that followed lasted only a second before the laughter erupted. It was not polite, nervous laughter. It was deep, belly-aching amusement. Loretta threw her head back, her gold jewelry catching the sunlight. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head as he took another sip of his bourbon. He sipped his bourbon. He looked away. He did nothing. He always did nothing. He always chose their laughter over my dignity. He always chose his mother's approval over his wife's respect. Brad walked over to my small patio table. He was a trust fund dropout who liked to play high-end investment broker, projecting an air of superiority that was entirely unearned. He thrived on weaponizing his privilege against me. He smirked down at me, reaching out and grabbing the last piece of Wagyu rib straight off my plate. She is used to having nothing, Brad said, chewing loudly. Let the adults eat. I looked at Brad. I looked at Valerie. I looked at Marcus, who was still standing by the bar, deliberately avoiding my gaze. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in their faces. Years of their emotional abuse had hardened me into something they could not comprehend. I had spent 5 years fixing their credit scores. I had spent 5 years funding their luxury lifestyle. I had spent 5 years being the invisible architect of their wealth. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for compliance. They mistook my love for Marcus as a permanent chain that would bind me to their disrespect forever. I picked up my half-eaten hot dog. I raised it in the air like a toast, looking directly into Valerie's mocking eyes. I smiled, letting the absolute coldness of my realization reach my face. Challenge accepted, I said clearly. I did not wait for a reaction. I stood up, smoothed down my skirt, and walked through the manicured garden, straight out the iron front gates. I got into my car and drove away. I drove away from the noise. I drove away from the disrespect. I drove away from the fake empire I had built for them. The drive back to our luxury townhouse was peaceful. The tears I thought I would shed never came. Instead, a profound, calculating clarity washed over me. For years, I had been the senior corporate fraud auditor who cleaned up their messes. I knew every account number, every routing code, and every hidden debt they possessed. I had woven a safety net so dense they thought they were floating on their own success. They thought the money came from their brilliance. They thought the status came from their bloodline. They were wrong. When I arrived at this townhouse, I moved with mechanical precision. I called a premium moving service I retained for corporate relocations. Within 2 hours, a team of professionals was packing up everything I had purchased with my own money: the custom velvet sofas, the antique dining table, the designer rugs, the entire master bedroom suite. I packed my personal documents, my servers, and my peace of mind. I left the house echoing with emptiness. When Marcus returned to our townhouse at midnight, the party buzz still lingering in his system, he was ready for a fight. He was ready to gaslight me, ready to tell me I was overreacting, ready to force me to apologize to his mother and sister for leaving abruptly. He expected to find a weeping wife waiting to be scolded. But the townhouse was completely dark. The walls were bare. The spaces where our life used to be were stripped down to the drywall and hardwood floors. The only thing waiting for him was sitting directly under the pendant light on the pristine marble kitchen island. It was his metallic platinum credit card cut perfectly in half. The card I paid the balance on every single month. Next to the severed plastic lay a single handwritten note on a piece of my heavy stock stationery. Try paying for your own life. I am a ghost. The first 48 hours after my departure were a masterclass in denial and delusion. Marcus left furious gaslighting voicemails on my phone, assuming I had checked into a local hotel to pout. Stop acting ghetto and come apologize to my mother. His recorded voice blared through my encrypted laptop speakers. You are making a massive deal out of a harmless joke. Valerie was just playing around. Turn your phone on, bring the furniture back, and stop trying to embarrass me. I am not playing these games with you, Simone. I ignored every single message. I was not playing games either. I was executing a financial demolition. Sitting in my secure, undisclosed location, I logged into my master server. The dual monitors glowed in the dark room, reflecting the sprawling network of finances I had managed for the family. They thought I was just a quiet wife who worked in data. They forgot I was a risk analyst who specialized in asset management and fraud detection. I systematically severed my name from every joint account. I removed my credentials from their limited liability companies. I canceled the auto-pay systems I had secretly set up to keep their lifestyle afloat. I deleted my name from the mortgages. I deleted my name from the car loans. I deleted my name from their entire fake reality. Every safety net I had woven for them was unraveled with a few keystrokes. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the impending disaster, Valerie was busy complaining on their family group chat. Through a backdoor access I had not yet closed, I watched her messages pop up on my screen. Simone is being so dramatic over a joke, Valerie texted. She always wants to be the victim. Like, does she want a medal for paying my warehouse lease every month? She acts like she carries this family. She had accidentally typed the quiet truth out loud. I was the one who paid the commercial lease for her luxury lifestyle brand's warehouse. Valerie had atrocious credit, so I had secured the lease under my holding company, Simone Holdings, LLC. She thought she was insulting me, but she was merely providing written confirmation of my financial ownership. I smiled at the screen, initiated the cancellation of the warehouse lease payments, and permanently locked myself out of their chat. The bridge was officially burned. The first real shockwave hit the family on Tuesday evening. Brad, attempting to soothe Valerie's stress over my sudden disappearance, decided to take her out to a Michelin-star restaurant in downtown Atlanta. They ordered hundreds of dollars in imported wine, a massive seafood tower, and the most expensive steaks on the menu. They laughed, they ate, and they reveled in my absence. When the waiter brought the leather checkbook, Brad casually tossed his black card onto the table, not even looking up from his conversation. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned looking incredibly uncomfortable. I am so sorry, sir, but your card has been declined, the waiter said softly. Brad's face turned bright red. He snatched the card back, his white privilege flaring up into instant outrage. Do you know who I am? Brad demanded, his voice echoing through the quiet, elegant dining room. Run it again. Your machine is obviously broken. I spend more in a week than you make in a year. The waiter, trembling, ran the card again. Declined. Brad threw a massive tantrum, demanding the manager come out and respect his status. He yelled that he was an elite investment broker and that the restaurant was insulting him. The entire dining room watched in disgusted fascination as Valerie tried to hide her face behind her designer handbag. Brad slammed a different credit card onto the table. That one declined too. Humiliated and seething with rage, Brad stormed out to the restaurant lobby to call his bank, leaving Valerie at the table with the unpaid bill. He dialed the customer service number, screaming at the representative the moment they answered. "Why the hell are my cards declining?" Brad yelled into the phone, pacing back and forth in front of the restaurant's glass doors. "I have a credit limit of $100,000. Fix this immediately, or I am suing your entire institution." The bank teller remained perfectly calm, pulling up his file. The response she delivered was a precise clinical strike that shattered Brad's arrogant reality. "Sir," the teller said clearly, "your accounts were frozen by the primary guarantor. All credit lines associated with your name have been revoked by Simone Holdings, LLC. You currently have a negative balance of $84,000 due to unpaid margin calls that were previously covered by the guarantor. Since the guarantor has withdrawn support, your accounts are in default." Brad stood frozen in the lobby, his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw hanging open, the color completely drained from his face. For 3 years, Brad had paraded around Atlanta, pretending to be a financial genius, constantly mocking my working-class roots. He had mocked my clothes. He had mocked my family background. He had grabbed food off my plate and told me I was used to having nothing. He did not know that his entire investment firm was a house of cards. He did not know that I was the primary guarantor, keeping his fraudulent trades from defaulting. He did not know that the money he spent on luxury dinners and designer clothes was essentially an allowance I provided to keep Marcus happy. Without my holding company covering his losses, Brad was not a high-end investment broker. He was a broke, fraudulent failure swimming in a massive ocean of debt. The manager approached Brad in the lobby accompanied by 2 large security guards. "Sir," the manager said coldly, "your wife's cards have also been declined. How do you intend to pay your bill tonight?" Brad had no answer. The empire of lies was crumbling, and the autopay apocalypse had only just begun. I was no longer the wallpaper. I was the wrecking ball. Brad kicked open the heavy oak doors to Marcus's corner office. Marcus jumped, spilling his black coffee across a stack of performance reports. Brad slammed both hands onto the mahogany desk, his face a mottled, furious red. He demanded to know where I was hiding. He screamed that I had financially abandoned his family, a concept that was as laughable as it was legally baseless. He threatened to sue me, claiming he would drag my name through the Atlanta courts. Marcus, ever the coward, shrank back into his ergonomic leather chair. He stammered, apologizing to a man who had spent the last 3 years living off his wife's paycheck. Marcus promised he would fix the situation immediately. He assured Brad that I was just throwing a temporary tantrum and would return to my duties by the weekend. By noon, Marcus had panicked enough to hire a private investigator. He pulled $5,000 in cash from his office safe, handing it to an older investigator named Vance. Marcus demanded Vance track my phone, trace my license plate, and find the luxury hotel he assumed I was hiding in. He expected Vance to return with a room number by dinner so he could come drag me home. Exactly 24 hours later, Vance walked right back into Marcus's office. He did not say a word at first. He just tossed the thick envelope of cash back onto the glass coffee table. Marcus demanded to know my exact location. Vance looked at my husband with a mixture of pity and dread. "Your wife does not exist anymore," Vance said flatly. Marcus laughed out loud, calling the investigator incompetent. He insisted I was a normal woman who probably checked into the Ritz-Carlton under her maiden name. Vance shook his head. He explained that my digital footprint was completely wiped clean. My social security number tracked back to a defunct holding company. My vehicle registration pointed to an empty commercial lot in a different state. I was legally a ghost. Before Vance walked out of the door, he stopped and looked back. "She left a message for you," Vance added. "She said you need to check your IRS portal immediately." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He scrambled to his computer, his hands shaking violently as he tried to remember his login credentials for the government tax site. When the page finally loaded, a red notification banner flashed across the screen indicating an ongoing federal audit into 7 years of misclassified business expenses. While Marcus was hyperventilating over his impending tax fraud charges, I was sitting comfortably in an offshore leased property. I opened a secure encrypted email server on my secondary laptop. It was time to pull the plug on Brad. Brad loved to brag to his wealthy country club friends about his aggressive investment strategies. He never knew that his portfolio was a chaotic mess of an illegal margin trading and commingled funds. It was a textbook mini Ponzi scheme. For 3 years I had written custom algorithms to shuffle money around, patching his massive losses just enough to keep the Securities and Exchange Commission completely blind to his activities. I only did it because Marcus had foolishly co-signed 2 of Brad's primary business loans. If Brad went down, Marcus would face federal indictment as a co-conspirator. I no longer cared about protecting Marcus or his image. I selected the direct email addresses of Brad's top 30 investors. These were powerful people in the Atlanta scene who did not tolerate being robbed by arrogant brokers. I attached 60 pages of unredacted financial ledgers. I highlighted every fabricated return, every illegal transfer, and every single dollar Brad had siphoned into his personal checking account to buy Valerie's designer handbags. In the main body of the email, I wrote a very polite message explaining that the previous guarantor had officially withdrawn all financial support and that they should contact local authorities regarding their missing funds immediately. I hit send. The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. Less than 2 hours later, Brad pulled his leased Porsche wildly into Marcus's driveway. He threw the car in park, leaving the engine running and the driver door wide open. Marcus was walking out of the front door, his face pale and sweating from the massive tax debt he had just discovered on his IRS portal. Brad lunged at him, grabbing Marcus violently by the lapels of his tailored suit. Brad screamed that I had completely ruined him. He spit as he yelled, demanding that Marcus force me to retract the emails. Brad's phone was ringing non-stop in his pocket. Furious wealthy investors were demanding their money back. Brad shoved Marcus against the brick pillar of the porch, blaming my husband for failing to control his black wife. Marcus tried to push him away, shouting that he had his own massive problems, that the IRS was coming for everything he owned. They were so busy yelling at each other on the front lawn that they did not notice the vehicles turning onto the quiet, affluent street. 3 heavy black SUVs with deeply tinted windows rolled up to the curb, boxing in Brad's running Porsche. The doors opened simultaneously. Men and women wearing tactical vests with federal insignias stepped out onto the pristine suburban concrete. Brad froze his hands, still gripping Marcus's jacket tightly. Marcus stopped breathing entirely. An agent with a stern face walked straight up the driveway, holding a thick stack of official paperwork. He did not care about Brad's country club memberships or his supposed elite status. He looked directly at Brad, stated his full legal name, and announced loudly that he was being placed under federal arrest for wire fraud, securities, fraud, and grand embezzlement. Brad let go of Marcus and took a trembling step back, his arrogant facade shattering into sheer, unadulterated terror as the cold steel handcuffs clicked into place, signaling the bitter end of his fraudulent empire. Valerie watched from the grand columns of the front porch as the heavy doors of the federal SUV slammed shut. The vehicles sped away down the immaculate suburban street, taking her fraudulent husband with them. Marcus remained glued to the concrete driveway, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Valerie marched down the steps, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She grabbed Marcus by his tailored shoulders and demanded that he call his corporate lawyers immediately to bail Brad out. Marcus violently shoved her hands away. He screamed that he had no lawyers left, that his accounts were frozen, and that the IRS was currently seizing every asset attached to his name. Valerie refused to accept this reality. She refused to be poor. She refused to lose her status in the Atlanta elite. If her brother was too weak to fight back, she would destroy me herself. Valerie retreated into her sprawling custom-built home and went straight to her studio. She set up her professional ring light, adjusted her flawless makeup, and hit the live button on her Instagram account. Within minutes, over 50,000 of her 500,000 followers tuned in. Valerie let perfectly timed tears stream down her contoured cheeks. She looked into the lens and delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She sobbed, telling her audience that her family was the victim of a vicious, coordinated attack. She spun a wild narrative about her evil, jealous sister-in-law, a woman from the wrong side of the tracks who could not handle the pressure of marrying into a prominent black family. Valerie claimed that I had maliciously hacked her husband's legitimate investment firm and framed him with fake financial documents, all because my fragile ego was bruised over a harmless joke at a family barbecue. Right on cue, Loretta stepped gracefully into the camera frame. My mother-in-law wore a pristine silk blouse and her signature pearls projecting the ultimate image of a resilient matriarch. She placed a comforting hand on Valerie's shoulder and looked directly into the camera lens with absolute disdain. Loretta told the thousands of viewers that their family bloodline was pure. She proudly declared that their wealth and reputation were built on generations of excellence and that they had simply made a terrible charitable mistake by allowing a lower-class saboteur into their sacred circle. Loretta urged their megachurch community and the citizens of Atlanta to pray for them while they purged this toxic, ungrateful woman from their lives. The live chat instantly flooded with heart emojis, prayers, and thousands of comments cursing my name. Valerie ended the broadcast feeling incredibly empowered. The viral sympathy was pouring in, and she saw a massive financial opportunity. She immediately texted her social media management team and her professional camera crew, ordering them to meet her at her luxury cosmetics fulfillment center in Midtown Atlanta. Valerie decided she would capitalize on the tragedy by doing an impromptu promotional shoot to launch her new summer makeup collection. She wanted to show the world that a strong, independent business owner could never be broken by a jealous relative. Valerie drove her white Range Rover aggressively through the city traffic, rehearsing her motivational speech for the cameras. She pulled into the expansive commercial lot, expecting her warehouse manager to be waiting with the loading bay doors open. Her camera crew was already standing on the sidewalk with their equipment ready. Valerie grabbed her designer handbag, tossed her hair back, and strutted up to the massive double-glass doors of her headquarters. She grabbed the polished metal handles and pulled. The doors did not move. Valerie yanked them harder, her manicured nails digging into the metal. She looked down and let out a sharp gasp of outrage. A heavy industrial-grade steel chain was wrapped tightly around the handles, secured by a massive padlock. Taped directly at eye level on the pristine glass was a bright red legal notice. Valerie started screaming at her camera crew, demanding to know who had locked her out of her own building. She pulled out her phone to call the property manager, ready to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. Before she could dial the number, a plain four-door sedan pulled up to the curb. A man in a sharp beige suit stepped out. He did not look like building security. He walked with the calm, methodical pace of a man executing a legal mandate. He approached Valerie holding a thick, heavy binder packed with legal documents. He asked her to confirm her identity. Valerie haughtily replied that she was the founder and chief executive officer of the cosmetics brand, and she demanded that he remove the chains from her property immediately. The man simply nodded and pressed the heavy binder firmly against her chest. He announced that she had been officially served and was currently trespassing on private commercial property. Valerie ripped the binder open, expecting to see a standard eviction notice regarding the warehouse lease. She thought I was just playing a petty game by stopping the monthly rent payments. She planned to pay the landlord directly using the profits from her upcoming launch. But as her eyes scanned the top page of the legal injunction, the confident, arrogant posture completely vanished from her body. The document was not an eviction notice. It was a comprehensive federal cease and desist order. For years, Valerie had operated her luxury brand under the assumption that she was a self-made millionaire. She forgot that her credit history was completely destroyed from defaulting on 3 previous boutique ventures. She forgot that 5 years ago she had come crying to Marcus begging for capital to start her cosmetics line. She never bothered to read the thick stack of incorporation papers I had drafted for her to sign when I agreed to secure the funding. Simone Holdings, LLC did not just quietly pay the commercial lease every month to hide Valerie's bad credit. The legal documents outlined the brutal, undeniable truth. My holding company owned the chemical formulas for every single lotion, foundation, and gloss in her warehouse. My company held the exclusive manufacturing patents. My company legally owned the trademark, the logo, and the entire intellectual property of the luxury lifestyle brand. Valerie was essentially a glorified, unpaid spokesperson for my corporation. The process server looked at Valerie's pale, horrified face. He pointed to the bottom of the cease and desist order. He stated clearly for her camera crew to hear that my holding company was immediately withdrawing her licensing rights. He told her she was legally barred from entering the facility, accessing the inventory, or selling a single tube of lipstick ever again. If she attempted to monetize the brand in any capacity, she would be subjected to immediate federal prosecution for intellectual property theft. Valerie dropped the heavy binder onto the concrete, the papers scattered across the pavement. She stared at the padlocked doors of the warehouse, her knees buckling as she realized her entire identity, her wealth and her viral influencer empire, belonged completely to the woman she had proudly called Wallpaper. While Valerie was collapsing on the concrete pavement outside her former warehouse, Marcus was aggressively pacing the reception area of Sterling and Vance, the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. He had spent the last 48 hours leaving unhinged voicemails bouncing between calling me a ghetto embarrassment and begging me to come home. When the federal agents hauled his brother-in-law away in handcuffs and the IRS portal locked him out with a catastrophic audit warning, the arrogance finally bled out of him. He realized he could not simply yell his way out of this crisis. He needed the one person who always fixed his messes. He needed me. Marcus slammed his palms against the receptionist's mahogany desk, demanding to see Arthur Vance, the senior partner I had retained. He shouted that he was a prominent executive, throwing around his mother's social status, insisting that his wife was just throwing a hormonal fit. The receptionist did not even blink. She pressed a hidden button under her desk. Two towering security guards appeared instantly, ready to drag him out by the collar of his unpaid designer suit. Before they could touch him, Vance stepped out of his corner office, adjusting his expensive tie. He coldly gestured for Marcus to step inside. Marcus rushed into the expansive office, dropping his aggressive facade the second the heavy oak door clicked shut. He threw himself into a leather guest chair, running a shaking hand over his face. He looked directly at the sleek conference camera mounted on the wall, assuming correctly that I was watching the live feed from my secure location. "Babe, you made your point," Marcus pleaded, his voice dripping with that signature manipulative charm he used whenever he had gambled away our savings or let his family disrespect me. "You proved you are the smartest person in the room. You scared Brad. You humbled Valerie. I get it. Now please come home and fix this before my mom has a heart attack. The feds are crawling all over the estate and the IRS is freezing my personal accounts. Stop this childish game. We are a team." Vance sat behind his massive desk, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not offer Marcus a glass of water. He did not offer sympathy. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out a slim digital tablet, and slid it across the polished glass surface. "I think my client would disagree with your definition of a team," Vance stated calmly. Marcus picked up the tablet. The screen illuminated, playing high-definition security footage captured from the outdoor cameras at Loretta's Buckhead estate during the barbecue. The audio was crystal clear. The footage showed me sitting quietly at the edge of the patio while Valerie delivered her cruel speech about me being invisible wallpaper. But the video did not stop there. It zoomed in tightly on Marcus. It captured the exact moment Brad snatched the Wagyu rib off my plate and insulted my working-class background. It captured Marcus turning his head, swirling his bourbon, and laughing. It captured the absolute absence of a husband defending his wife. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously away from the screen. "That was taken entirely out of context," he stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "You know how my family is, Simone. They joke around. I was just trying to keep the peace. You know I love you. You cannot throw away a 5-year marriage over a stupid barbecue." Vance reached into his briefcase a second time. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. He dropped it onto the desk with a resounding thud that made Marcus flinch. My client is not throwing away a marriage over a barbecue. Vance replied, his tone devoid of any warmth. She is terminating a parasitic financial arrangement. You are officially served. Marcus stared at the bold black lettering on the front page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. His fake contrition vanished instantly, replaced by the toxic, entitled rage that had fueled his entire life. The charming husband mask shattered. He jumped out of the chair, pointing an accusing finger at the camera on the wall. He screamed that I was a vindictive, ungrateful woman who would be nothing without his family's elite Atlanta name. If you want a divorce, fine, Marcus sneered, puffing out his chest to regain some semblance of authority. But do not think you can just walk away and leave me with nothing. I know exactly how much money your holding company makes. I know about the commercial real estate. I know about the offshore accounts. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. I will take half of everything she has. Tell your client I am hiring the best divorce attorneys in the city, and I am going to bleed her dry. Vance did not look intimidated. He actually chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that completely derailed Marcus's rant. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, folding his hands neatly over his stomach. Half of zero is zero, Marcus Vance said with a chilling smile. Marcus froze, his arrogant posture faltering. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice cracking. Vance tapped the blue folder. I highly recommend you flip to page 42 of the divorce petition. 3 years ago, when you came crying to my client because you had secretly leveraged your marital home to cover one of Brad's failed crypto investments, Simone agreed to bail you out. In exchange, she required you to sign a standard stack of financial restructuring documents. You were so desperate for her money and so careless with legal paperwork that you simply blindly signed everywhere she put a sticky note. Marcus frantically flipped through the heavy stack of papers, his hands tearing the corners of the pages, until he found the document Vance mentioned. His eyes widened in absolute horror. One of those documents was an ironclad, waiver-heavy, post-nuptial agreement, Vance explained smoothly. You legally signed away your right to alimony, spousal support, and any claim to Simone Holdings, LLC, or its subsidiary assets. You agreed that any debt incurred under your name or your business entities would remain your sole and separate responsibility. You legally own absolutely nothing of hers. Marcus collapsed back into the chair, the document slipping from his trembling fingers and scattering across the floor. He could barely breathe. The reality of his complete financial ruin was crushing his chest. He looked at the camera, tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. He realized the woman he called wallpaper had quietly engineered his total destruction. Furthermore, Vance continued, his voice sharp like a scalpel, delivering the final fatal blow. Because my client has officially removed herself as your financial guarantor and severed her holding company from your commercial entities, you are now personally liable for the discrepancies the IRS flagged this morning. You owe the federal government $1.2 million in back taxes for the fraudulent business expenses you and your brother-in-law claimed over the past 5 years. The government does not negotiate with frauds. Good luck, Marcus. Marcus stumbled out of the corporate litigation firm with his chest heaving. His tailored suit felt like a straitjacket. He was a dead man walking. When he finally dragged himself back to his mother's Buckhead estate and confessed the reality of his $1.2 million tax debt, Loretta did not comfort him. She did not offer to pay it. Instead, she went into a state of absolute self-righteous fury. If her family was going to be financially ruined by federal audits and locked warehouses, she would make sure I was socially and spiritually annihilated. Loretta was a founding member of the largest, most influential megachurch in Atlanta. She sat on the board of directors, controlling the narrative of the city's black elite. By Wednesday evening, she had summoned the senior pastor and the 7 highest-ranking church elders for an emergency moral tribunal in the executive boardroom of the church's administrative wing. She intended to have me formally excommunicated publicly, shunned from the pulpit, and branded an enemy of their sacred community. The boardroom was an opulent display of untaxed wealth. It featured a massive mahogany table and a wall-sized digital projector. Loretta stood at the head of the table, dressed in a somber black designer suit, clutching a leather-bound Bible. She wept pristine, calculated tears. She told the solemn men sitting around the table that her family was under spiritual attack. She wove a masterful, vicious tale about a jealous, impoverished girl they had graciously welcomed into their pure, God-fearing bloodline. She is a wicked Jezebel, Loretta declared, her voice trembling with intense, manufactured grief. We gave her a seat at our family table when she had absolutely nothing. We elevated her. And how does she repay us? By trying to destroy my son. By hacking into my son-in-law's legitimate business and framing him with federal crimes. By locking my innocent daughter out of her own hard-earned cosmetics company. She is a saboteur driven by pure low-class envy. I am asking this board to stand with our family. I am asking you to publicly denounce Simone from the pulpit this Sunday, so no other respectable family in Atlanta falls victim to her venom. The powerful elders murmured in deep agreement. They nodded sympathetically at the wealthy matriarch they had respected for decades. The senior pastor opened his mouth to assure Loretta that the entire church would fully support her. Before he could speak a single word of comfort, the massive digital projector screen on the wall suddenly flared to life. The church logo vanished. The elders gasped, startled by the sudden intrusion. Loretta spun around, her eyes widening in absolute horror. My face filled the screen. I was sitting in my secure offshore office sipping a cup of chamomile tea. I wore a simple, elegant white blouse. I did not look like a frantic, jealous saboteur. I looked perfectly at peace. I had anticipated Loretta playing the religion card. I knew exactly which private network the church boardroom used, and overriding their presentation screen was child's play for a senior data analyst. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the boardroom's surround sound speakers. "I apologize for interrupting your tribunal, but I felt it was only fair that the accused gets to present her defense." Loretta slammed her hands onto the table. "Turn that off!" she shrieked, her composed, grieving mother facade completely evaporating. "Security, someone cut the power to that screen. She is hacking into a house of God." "I would not do that, Pastor," I warned. I kept my voice incredibly soft yet sharp enough to slice through the heavy tension in the room. "Because if this screen goes dark before I am finished, the files I am about to show you will automatically be forwarded to the local news stations and the state attorney general. I think you will want to see this privately first." The senior pastor held up a hand, silencing Loretta. He looked at the screen, his expression hardening. "What files, Simone?" he demanded. "Loretta, you just told these men that your family represents pure God-fearing excellence," I stated calmly. "You called me a jealous Jezebel who was out to ruin your legacy. But you forgot one crucial detail. I am the one who audits your legacy. I am the one who tracks the numbers. And numbers, unlike your family, do not lie." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply clicked a button on my end, and my video feed shrank to the corner of the projection, replacing the main view with a high-definition color-coded spreadsheet. It was the internal accounting ledger for the church's most prestigious charity account, the Atlanta Orphan and Widow Relief Fund. The elders leaned forward, squinting at the confidential financial records they thought were securely locked away. "Let us review the purity of your bloodline." Loretta. I narrated smoothly as my cursor highlighted a series of massive withdrawals dating back 3 years. "You see, gentlemen, as a risk management auditor, I always found it fascinating how Loretta could afford to maintain her Buckhead estate while neither of her children produced a single dime of actual profit. It turns out she was using the church's charity fund as her personal piggy bank." Loretta lunged for the computer terminal on the table, desperately trying to yank the cords out of the wall. The senior pastor grabbed her wrist. His grip was like a vice, forcing her back into her chair. "Look at row 42, I instructed. Last August, $55,000 was transferred from the Youth Ministry Outreach Program directly to a luxury auto dealership in Midtown. That was the exact down payment for Valerie's white Range Rover." The elders gasped. The room erupted into furious, chaotic whispers. "Now look at row 87, I continued. I highlighted a recurring monthly deduction of $4,000. That is the exact cost of Marcus and Brad's joint membership at the Buckhead Country Club, billed directly to the church's Emergency Housing Assistance Fund. You have been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the congregation's tithes to fund your children's fake elite lifestyles. The silence that fell over the boardroom was deafening. It was a suffocating heavy quiet as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal sank into the minds of the church leaders. Loretta stood frozen at the head of the table. The color had completely drained from her face. Her designer suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie to deflect the blame, but no words came out. I took a final sip of my tea. "I think we are done here," I said softly. "I will leave you gentlemen to discuss your moral tribunal." The screen went black. The senior pastor and the 7 elders slowly turned their heads in unison. Their cold eyes locked onto Loretta, blazing with a righteous, unholy, and absolutely unforgiving fury. The boardroom erupted. The senior pastor stood up, pointed a trembling finger at the heavy oak door, and demanded Loretta hand over her church security badge and corporate credit cards immediately. Loretta tried to spin a lie about administrative errors, but the cold glare of 7 powerful men silenced her. The pastor informed her that she was permanently stripped of all titles, banned from the church grounds, and that their legal team would forward the digital evidence to the district attorney by morning. Loretta snatched her designer handbag and fled down the carpeted hallway. This was impossible. She was the queen of Atlanta high society. She burst through the glass doors and marched to her luxury sedan, her hands shaking violently as she fumbled with her keys, unable to process her sudden disgrace. Sitting in the driver's seat, Loretta pulled out her phone. She desperately needed the powerful women who drank sweet tea on her veranda. She dialed the president of the local country club. Voicemail. She dialed the mayor's wife. Voicemail. She dialed 5 more prominent socialites. Every single call was ignored. The news of her embezzlement had already ripped through the city. Elite society was ruthless. They smiled in your face when your bank account was full, but the moment the scent of federal fraud hit the air, they amputated the infected limb without hesitation. Loretta was entirely alone. She drove recklessly back to her sprawling Buckhead mansion. Bursting through the mahogany double doors, she found Marcus, sitting on the foyer staircase, with his head buried in his hands, rambling incoherently about the IRS audit and Brad's federal arrest. Loretta grabbed her son by the shoulder and shook him hard. She demanded he stop acting like a victim. The church was threatening criminal charges, and they needed a high-powered defense attorney immediately. They needed a $500,000 retainer by the end of the week. Marcus looked up, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. His personal accounts were frozen and his business assets were completely locked. But then a spark of arrogant entitlement returned to his face. He remembered his cars. Sitting in the pristine garage were his custom Aston Martin and his imported luxury sport utility vehicle. He told his mother they could liquidate the vehicles. They were worth at least $300,000 combined. He could sell them to a private broker downtown and have the cash transferred by morning. Marcus stood up, adjusting his collar, trying to regain his swagger. He opened the heavy front door, ready to march to the garage. He stopped dead on the front porch. 2 massive tow trucks were backing slowly up the manicured driveway. Men in neon safety vests jumped out of the cabs and began unspooling thick steel cables. Marcus sprinted down the front steps, waving his arms wildly, screaming at the men to get off his private property. He demanded they stop touching his vehicles, insisting there had been a terrible mistake with his bank. The lead driver did not flinch. He calmly pulled a clipboard from his belt. Marcus barked his name, demanding the police be called. The driver tapped the paperwork. "The police do not handle corporate repossessions, sir," the driver stated flatly. "These vehicles are registered as fleet assets under Simone Holdings, LLC. The corporate guarantor officially revoked the long-term lease agreement exactly an hour ago. We have a court-ordered mandate to retrieve the assets. Touch my cables and I will have you arrested immediately." Marcus stood frozen on the concrete. He watched in helpless horror as the drivers hooked the steel cables to the undercarriages of his sports cars. The heavy winches whined loudly, dragging the symbols of his fake wealth up onto the flatbeds. Marcus fell to his knees in the driveway. He watched his entire identity roll away down the street, completely disappearing from view. Loretta watched the humiliating scene from the porch. She grabbed Marcus by the collar forcefully, dragging him back inside before the neighbors could record the disgrace. She slammed the heavy doors shut. Marcus was sobbing loudly, completely broken by the brutal reality of his own uselessness. Loretta slapped him sharply across the cheek. She ordered him to stand up and act like a man. She paced the marble foyer, her heels echoing off the high ceilings. She told him that cars were just toys. She told him that bank accounts could be easily rebuilt. She spread her arms wide, gesturing to the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandelier, and the priceless antique art lining the walls. "We still have the bloodline," Loretta declared, her voice echoing with delusional pride. "We still have generational wealth. This estate has been the crown jewel of our family for decades. As long as we have this beautiful roof over our heads, we are absolutely untouchable. Simone cannot take our history." Loretta walked over to the gilded entry table. A thick stack of mail sat perfectly arranged on a silver tray. She grabbed the pile, flipping through the envelopes, desperately looking for a dividend check from an old family trust or a supportive letter from a distant relative. She deeply needed a lifeline. Her manicured thumb stopped on a thick, certified envelope stamped with the official seal of the Fulton County Clerk of Superior Court. The red lettering on the front demanded immediate attention. Loretta felt a strange cold knot form in the pit of her stomach. Her hands began to shake again as she tore the rigid cardboard open. She pulled out a stack of legal documents. Marcus watched her face carefully. He watched the haughty, arrogant pride melt away entirely, rapidly, replaced by a hollow, breathless terror. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered softly to the marble floor. Marcus dropped to his knees and picked up the document. He read the bold letters across the top page. Notice of foreclosure auction. Loretta snatched the foreclosure notice from Marcus. Her manicured nails dug into the thick parchment. The ancestral Buckhead mansion, the very crown jewel of their fake elite bloodline, was scheduled for public auction in exactly 14 days. Marcus stood frozen in the grand marble foyer. He had no cars. He had a massive federal tax debt. Now he was losing his childhood home. Loretta did not collapse into a puddle of tears. She pivoted immediately to ruthless survival mode. She ordered Marcus to call every single predatory lender in the greater Atlanta area. She demanded he leverage whatever was left of their ruined family name to secure a high-interest short-term loan. They needed $3.5 million in pure cash to buy the estate back at the courthouse steps. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks begging. He sat in dingy, windowless offices with loan sharks who charged extortionate interest rates. He forged income projections on his laptop. He lied to criminal lenders about pending business deals that did not exist. He mortgaged his own soul and his future to secure the funds. Back at the mansion, Valerie was hiding from her own public disgrace. She sat on the floor of the empty living room while cheap movers boxed up the antique furniture they could no longer afford to maintain. Marcus walked in and handed his sister a freshly printed cashier check. "Once we get this house back," Marcus sneered, pacing the hardwood floor with renewed, unearned arrogance, "we will hire a real cutthroat lawyer. We will track Simone down and absolutely crush her. She thinks she won a battle, but she just started a war." Valerie nodded, her eyes flashing with vindictive pride. "They still thought I was just a lucky amateur. They still deeply underestimated the architect of their absolute ruin." The morning of the Fulton County foreclosure auction arrived with suffocating Georgia heat. The courthouse steps were crowded with aggressive real estate investors, local developers and bargain hunters looking to scavenge the remains of bankrupted elites. Marcus walked up the concrete steps, wearing his last clean-tailored suit. The fabric clung to his sweating back. Loretta flanked his right side, hiding her disgraced face behind massive designer sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. Valerie flanked his left side, clutching a counterfeit handbag she had bought online to keep up appearances. They stood together, projecting a united, powerful front. They were ready to reclaim their throne and pretend the last month had never happened. The auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium, holding a thick binder of distressed properties. When the Buckhead estate was finally announced, a hushed whisper rippled through the crowd of investors. Everyone knew the mansion. Everyone knew the church embezzlement scandal. Marcus raised his numbered paddle high in the air. He confidently opened the bidding at $2 million. He expected the crowd to fall silent. He expected his bold opening move to intimidate the local scavengers into backing down immediately. 2.5 million, a calm, steady voice called out from the back of the crowd. Marcus whipped his head around. A man in a sharp-tailored gray suit stood near the towering courthouse columns. He held a leather briefcase and a numbered paddle. He did not look like a local developer. He did not look at Marcus. He kept his eyes locked, dead on the auctioneer, his posture perfectly rigid. Loretta nudged Marcus sharply in the ribs, her acrylic nails digging painfully into his suit jacket. She hissed at him under her breath, demanding he bid higher and shut the stranger down. 3 million, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking slightly with rising panic. 3.2 million, the man in the gray suit countered instantly, not missing a single beat. Marcus felt the sweat pouring down his face. The predatory loan he had secured from the underground lenders maxed out at exactly 3.5 million. Every single dollar he bid was a dollar of crushing, inescapable debt that he could never repay. If he won this bid, he would be paying off loan sharks for the rest of his natural life. But he looked at his mother. He saw the manic, terrifying desperation in her eyes behind the dark lenses. She would rather die than rent an apartment. He could not lose the house. He raised his paddle one last time, putting absolutely everything he had left in this world on the line. $3.5 million! Marcus screamed, his voice echoing frantically off the stone courthouse walls. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer raised his heavy wooden gavel, looking around the sunlit plaza for any final challenges. Marcus let out a shaky, ragged breath, believing he had finally secured his victory. He turned to glare at the man in the gray suit, ready to gloat, ready to feel powerful again. $4 million in pure, verified cash, the man in the gray suit stated evenly, his voice cutting through the humid air like a scythe. The auctioneer slammed his gavel against the podium block. Sold. The Buckhead estate officially transferred ownership. Loretta let out a strangled, breathless shriek. Her knees buckled right there on the courthouse steps. Valerie tried to catch her mother, dropping her fake handbag onto the dirty concrete. Marcus felt his entire world dissolve into ash. The predatory loan he held in his hands was now entirely useless. They were officially homeless. They had absolutely nothing left. Marcus saw red. The humiliation and raw rage boiled over. He stormed through the crowd of whispering investors, marching directly toward the man in the gray suit. The proxy buyer was calmly packing his bidding paddle into his leather briefcase, entirely unbothered by the dramatic scene unfolding. Marcus grabbed the man roughly by the shoulder, spinning him around aggressively. "Who the hell do you work for?" Marcus demanded, his face mere inches from the proxy buyer. "You just stole my ancestral home. Who authorized a $4 million cash bid for that property? Tell me who you represent right now before I call the police." The man in the gray suit did not flinch. He calmly brushed Marcus's sweaty hand off his expensive jacket sleeve. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a sleek, minimalist black business card with embossed silver lettering. He pressed the card firmly into Marcus's trembling palm. "I represent the new owner of the estate," the man said coldly. "She asked me to give this to you directly. She said you would want to know who your new landlord is." Marcus looked down at the black card. The bright Georgia sun glared off the silver letters. His heart stopped completely. He forgot how to breathe. The bold text on the business card delivered the most fatal, soul-crushing blow of his entire life. It read, "Wallpaper LLC, Chief Executive Officer Simone." Marcus stared at the sleek black business card in his trembling palm. The bright Georgia sun suddenly felt like ice. "Wallpaper LLC, Chief Executive Officer Simone." He dropped the card onto the courthouse concrete like it was burning his skin. Loretta snatched it up. Her eyes scanned the silver-embossed letters, and a guttural, raw shriek tore from her throat. The woman she had tormented, the daughter-in-law she had called lower-class trash, had just bought her ancestral Buckhead mansion with pure cash. They were not homeowners anymore. They were officially tenants of my holding company. Marcus grabbed his mother by the arm and dragged her toward their rented sedan. Valerie scrambled behind them, her fake designer bag clutched to her chest. Marcus sped back to the estate, running 3 red lights. He was hyperventilating, convinced that if they just got inside the house and locked the doors, they could claim squatters' rights. He refused to let the woman he had treated like a servant kick him out of his own childhood bedroom. He pulled into the circular driveway, tires screeching against the pavement. They ran up the front steps, shoved the heavy key into the mahogany double doors, and slammed them shut. Marcus threw the deadbolt. He dragged a heavy antique console table across the marble foyer, barricading the entrance. He yelled at Valerie to lock all the first-floor windows. They were going to hold the mansion hostage. They thought they could outsmart the legal system. They thought I would play fair. I never play fair with people who stole my peace. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, heavy, authoritative pounding echoed through the grand foyer. Marcus jolted awake on the living room sofa. He crept to the front window and peered through the silk curtains. 3 marked Fulton County Sheriff vehicles were parked diagonally across his manicured driveway. 4 uniformed deputies stood on the front porch. The lead deputy hammered his fist against the mahogany door, announcing loudly that they were executing a writ of possession on behalf of the new property owner. Simone Holdings, LLC, had officially filed an immediate eviction notice for illegal trespassing post-foreclosure. Marcus shouted through the thick glass that they had squatters' rights. He screamed that they needed a proper 30-day notice. The deputy simply held up a court order signed by a superior court judge. Because the property was purchased at a foreclosure auction by a commercial entity, and because Marcus had previously signed a post-nuptial agreement waiving all rights to my corporate assets, he was not a legal tenant. He was a trespasser. The deputy warned Marcus that he had exactly 60 seconds to open the door before they breached the property. Loretta stood at the top of the grand staircase, clutching her silk robe, her face utterly devoid of color. She realized her social reign was ending right here in her own foyer. Valerie was crying hysterically in the kitchen, frantically trying to pack her expensive jewelry into a trash bag. Just as the deputies retrieved a heavy steel battering ram from their vehicle, a screeching taxi pulled up to the curb. Brad stumbled out of the back seat. He was currently out on federal bail, wearing a wrinkled golf shirt, looking completely unhinged. He had spent the last week hiding in a cheap motel, terrified of his impending wire fraud trial. When Valerie texted him that they were being evicted, his toxic entitlement flared up. He still believed his white privilege and arrogant broker persona could intimidate local law enforcement. Brad stormed up the driveway, completely ignoring the flashing lights of the sheriff vehicles. He shoved his way past 2 deputies on the steps, pointing a shaking finger at the lead officer. He demanded that they leave his family alone. He screamed that this was a civil dispute and that they had no right to terrorize his mother-in-law. He puffed out his chest, using the aggressive, condescending tone he always used to belittle me at family dinners. He told the officers they were acting like thugs and that he would personally have all of their badges revoked by the mayor. The lead deputy calmly ordered Brad to step back. He informed Brad that he was interfering with a court-mandated eviction. Brad did not listen. He was too used to getting his way. He was too used to intimidating people. Brad took another aggressive step forward and violently shoved the deputy in the chest, screaming that he knew his constitutional rights. That was the worst mistake of his miserable life. The deputy did not hesitate. He did not negotiate with arrogant men assaulting officers. He drew his taser and fired. The sharp crack of the deployed prongs echoed across the pristine suburban lawn. The electric current hit Brad squarely in the chest. Brad let out a horrific, high-pitched shriek. His legs instantly folded underneath him. He collapsed onto the hard concrete porch, his body convulsing as the high voltage dropped him like a stone. The deputies immediately swarmed him. They flipped him aggressively onto his stomach, pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs locked his wrists together. The lead deputy leaned down and informed Brad that he was under arrest for assaulting a law enforcement officer. Furthermore, because he was currently out on federal bail for severe financial crimes, this violent arrest constituted an automatic violation of his release terms. His bail was instantly revoked. He was going straight to a maximum security holding cell until his federal trial. There would be no more luxury motels. There would be no more arrogant speeches. His fake empire was officially dead. Marcus watched the entire brutal scene through the front window, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The sheer terror of seeing his untouchable brother-in-law tased and dragged away broke his remaining spirit. Trembling uncontrollably, Marcus pushed the antique console table away from the door. He slowly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the mahogany doors open, raising his hands in absolute surrender. The deputies swarmed into the grand foyer. They gave Marcus, Loretta, and Valerie exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever they could physically carry. There would be no moving trucks. There would be no careful packing. Loretta wept openly, her mascara running down her face, as a female deputy escorted her out the front door. Marcus carried 2 heavy black garbage bags filled with his custom-tailored suits. He walked out onto the front lawn, his head hung low in complete, devastating humiliation. Valerie followed behind him, sobbing loudly, dragging a plastic sack full of cheap cosmetics. The entire neighborhood had gathered on the sidewalks. The wealthy Atlanta socialites, the same women who used to drink sweet tea on Loretta's veranda, were standing on their lawns with their phones out, recording every single second of the disgrace. They whispered and pointed as the deputies began carrying out the remaining belongings. Designer coats, expensive shoes, and fake luxury handbags were unceremoniously tossed onto the damp morning grass. Marcus stood on the curb clutching his garbage bags, watching his mother weep uncontrollably, while his brother-in-law was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The majestic Buckhead mansion, the ultimate symbol of their pure bloodline, was officially locked and secured behind them. They were standing on the street with absolutely nothing entirely erased from the elite world they loved so much. 6 months of absolute suffocating silence. I did not send a single gloating text message. I did not drive past their new neighborhood to watch them suffer. I simply ceased to exist in their reality, leaving them to marinate in the crushing poverty they had always weaponized against everyone else. They had traded the sprawling Buckhead estate for a cramped, damp 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying complex on the outskirts of Atlanta. The property management company did not care about the historic legacy of Loretta's pure bloodline. They only cared that the rent was paid by the first of the month in certified funds, a deadline that Marcus was currently failing to meet with spectacular consistency. Marcus sat at a sticky laminate dining table, staring blankly at a tall stack of final notice utility bills. The tailored Italian suits he managed to salvage from the eviction were now hopelessly wrinkled, smelling faintly of the cheap cooking oil permeating the apartment building corridors. He was working a brutal commission, only sales job, cold calling hostile clients to sell discount life insurance policies. He spent 10 hours a day sitting in a windowless cubicle being hung up on, cursed at, and treated with the exact same dismissive arrogance he used to aim at the service workers he deemed utterly beneath him. Every time his meager paycheck directly deposited, the IRS automatically garnished 70% of it to chip away at his massive federal tax debt. He had zero disposable income. He had no prestigious country club to escape to. He had no rich white brother-in-law to buy him expensive bourbon. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. Valerie had it even worse. The former luxury influencer who once boasted to 500,000 devoted followers about her self-made cosmetics empire was currently folding cheap polyester shirts at a fast fashion retail store in a dying suburban mall. Her designer acrylic nails had snapped off months ago. She was forced to wear a hideous neon green polyester uniform and a plastic name tag that dug into her collarbone. Her daily existence was a waking nightmare of extreme public humiliation. Teenage girls who used to follow her glamorous online life would frequently spot her working the cash register. They did not offer sympathy or kindness. They pulled out their smartphones, pointing the camera lenses directly in her face, recording her scanning clearance rack denim and bagging cheap accessories. They mocked her relentlessly, asking loudly what happened to her luxury warehouse, her white Range Rover, and her elite millionaire status. Valerie would bite the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, forcing a strained, humiliating smile while she handed them their receipts. Every night she rode the public city bus back to the cramped apartment, sobbing quietly in the back row, scrolling through my holding company's flawless press releases on her cracked phone screen. She was drowning in bitter, toxic resentment, utterly incapable of accepting accountability for her own financial incompetence. Loretta sat in the dark corner of the tiny apartment living room, staring blankly at a static-filled television screen. The disgraced matriarch had aged 20 years in just 6 months. She refused to leave the apartment, terrified of running into former church members who knew all about her charity fund embezzlement. She spent her days clutching a tattered leather Bible, demanding that Marcus figure out a way to sue me for severe emotional damages. She was completely disconnected from reality, clinging desperately to the phantom ghost of her ruined social standing, still believing that a miraculous bailout was coming to restore her rightful place in Atlanta society. One rainy Tuesday evening, Valerie finished her humiliating retail shift and trudged out to the poorly lit mall parking lot. She was shivering in the cold drizzle, waiting for her delayed bus, when a sleek black town car pulled up directly to the curb, splashing water onto her cheap sneakers. The deeply tinted window rolled down smoothly, revealing a woman with sharp facial features, oversized designer sunglasses despite the dark weather, and a highly predatory smile. The woman introduced herself as a senior producer for a highly rated, notoriously trashy reality television network based right there in Atlanta. She told Valerie that the entire city was still absolutely obsessed with the sudden spectacular downfall of her family's social empire. The producer stepped out of the idling car, completely ignoring the pouring rain, and handed Valerie a thick legal contract encased in a waterproof folder. The network wanted an exclusive, explosive primetime television interview. They wanted Valerie to sit in front of millions of eagerly watching viewers and spin a vicious, highly tragic narrative. They wanted her to explicitly name me, Simone, as a ruthless criminal mastermind who had maliciously scammed a wealthy, God-fearing black family out of their generational fortune. The producer promised to edit the footage to frame Valerie as the ultimate innocent victim of a jealous, psychotic sister-in-law who stole her company through shady legal loopholes. Valerie stared at the confident producer, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She asked what the network was willing to pay for her exclusive story. The producer did not even blink. She reached into her expensive trench coat, pulled out a certified bank check, and held it out in the cold rain. $50,000, the producer stated smoothly, her eyes locking onto Valerie's desperate face. And we will guarantee you a permanent spot on our next reality cast if the ratings hit our target projections. We want you to destroy Simone on national television. We want you to burn her reputation to the absolute ground. Valerie did not hesitate. She did not consult a lawyer to review the extensive non-disclosure clauses. She did not think about the severe legal consequences of public defamation against a holding company that already owned her entire intellectual property. Driven entirely by sheer greed, blind hatred, and the desperate burning need to be famous and wealthy again, Valerie snatched the silver pen from the producer's outstretched hand. She pressed the thick contract against the wet hood of the luxury town car and eagerly signed her name on the dotted line. She did not bother to read the fine print. She did not ask for a copy. She only saw the $50,000 check and the promise of a prime-time spotlight. She envisioned her glorious return to the elite circles of Atlanta, ready to destroy my name and rebuild her shattered influencer empire. 2 days later, Valerie strutted into a sleek, high-rise production studio in downtown Atlanta. She had spent the last of her retail paycheck on a cheap, knockoff designer dress and a professional blowout, desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy woman wronged by a jealous relative. The production assistant ushered her into a stark, brightly lit room featuring 2 plush velvet chairs facing each other over a clear glass coffee table. 3 massive high-definition cameras were positioned around the room, their red recording lights already blinking. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit walked in and sat across from Valerie. She introduced herself simply as Morgan. She did not have the exaggerated, overly dramatic energy of a typical reality television host, but Valerie was too consumed by her own vanity to notice the discrepancy. Morgan clipped a small microphone to Valerie's dress and asked her to state her full legal name for the record. Valerie complied, flashing her most practiced sympathetic smile toward the center camera lens. Morgan asked Valerie to explain exactly how she lost her luxury cosmetics company. Valerie took a deep breath and launched into a masterful, venomous performance. She squeezed out perfect, glistening tears, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She spun a tragic tale for the cameras, claiming that she had built her beauty brand from the ground up through sheer hard work and pure black excellence. She told Morgan that I was a bitter, impoverished woman who had manipulated her brother Marcus into marriage just to gain access to their generational wealth. Valerie claimed that I had exploited a minor clerical error in her incorporation paperwork to maliciously seize her entire warehouse and inventory out of petty jealousy. She looked directly into the primary camera and called me a dangerous, calculating predator who had ripped a thriving business away from an innocent entrepreneur. Valerie spoke for 20 uninterrupted minutes, laying out a timeline of absolute fiction. She felt a thrilling rush of adrenaline. She was convinced that this broadcast would turn the entire city of Atlanta against me and force me to hand her company back. Morgan sat perfectly still, letting Valerie exhaust her entire fabricated narrative. The interviewer did not nod in sympathy. She did not offer comforting words. When Valerie finally stopped speaking to catch her breath, Morgan slowly reached down into her leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a loud smack. Valerie, Morgan said, her voice dropping an octave into a cold, clinical tone. You just stated on the record that Simone maliciously stole your cosmetics company through a clerical error. But we have documents right here showing a very different story. Valerie forced a confident laugh, waving her hand dismissively. She told Morgan that whatever documents were in that envelope were obviously forged by my highly paid lawyers to cover up my crimes. Morgan opened the envelope. She did not pull out a script or a television production outline. She pulled out a stack of federal financial records. We have digital footprints here showing that you knowingly forged signatures to secure massive federal business loans under your sister-in-law's name, Morgan stated flatly, sliding the papers across the glass table. We have the IP addresses proving that you logged into a federal portal from your personal laptop and used Simone's social security number to apply for 3 separate relief grants totaling $200,000. You then funneled that federal money directly into your personal checking account to fund your lavish lifestyle. Care to comment on these federal wire fraud charges? Valerie froze completely. The fake tears dried up instantly. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the highlighted documents on the table. They were the exact loan applications she had secretly filed 3 years ago when her cosmetics brand was failing and she needed quick cash to buy a new Range Rover. She thought she had buried the digital trail. She thought nobody would ever look that closely at the holding company's subsidiary accounts. What kind of reality show is this? Valerie demanded, her voice shaking violently as she gripped the armrests of her velvet chair. Turn the cameras off right now. You cannot show my private financial records on television. Morgan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the glass table. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and absolutely merciless. This is not a reality television show, Valerie Morgan said smoothly. My name is Morgan Vance. I am a licensed forensic financial investigator retained by the corporate litigation firm of Sterling and Vance. I work directly for Simone Holdings LLC. Valerie felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She looked wildly at the 3 cameras still recording every single second of her panic. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt like lead. That contract you eagerly signed in the rain 2 days ago was not a television release form, Morgan explained, tapping the glowing red light on the microphone pack attached to Valerie's dress. It was a legally binding sworn deposition agreement. You explicitly agreed to sit for a recorded interview under the penalty of perjury. And you just spent the last 20 minutes lying on the record while actively confessing to the circumstances surrounding a massive federal loan fraud scheme. The air in the room evaporated. Valerie realized the $50,000 check was bait. The producer was a decoy. The entire production studio was a meticulously designed, inescapable legal trap. I had not just caught her in a lie, I had tricked her into providing a crystal-clear, high-definition video confession of her own federal crimes. Morgan slid a pen across the table, pointing to the fraudulent loan applications. "The FBI is already building a case against your husband," Morgan reminded her coldly. "Do you really want to share a federal indictment with him? Or would you like to start telling the truth right now?" Valerie let out a strangled, breathless sob. She ripped the microphone off her dress, throwing it violently against the glass table. She scrambled out of the velvet chair, her cheap designer heels slipping on the polished floor. She burst through the studio doors and sprinted down the hallway, leaving all the damning evidence sitting right there in front of the rolling cameras. She ran out into the busy Atlanta street, tears of absolute ruined terror streaming down her face, finally realizing that she could never ever outsmart the woman she used to call wallpaper. Valerie burst through the door of the cramped two-bedroom apartment, her cheap designer knockoff dress entirely ruined by the torrential Atlanta thunderstorm. She collapsed onto the stained linoleum floor of the tiny kitchen, hyperventilating and screaming that they were all going to federal prison. Marcus dropped the discount life insurance brochures he was supposed to be cold calling from. He rushed over to his sister, demanding to know what happened to the $50,000 reality television check. Valerie sobbed uncontrollably, choking out the horrifying truth about the fake production studio, the forensic investigator, and the high-definition video confession of her federal wire fraud. Marcus felt the cheap apartment walls closing in on him. He looked over at Loretta, who was sitting in a sagging armchair, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper and muttering prayers to a god who had clearly stopped listening. The final crushing realization of their absolute defeat washed over Marcus like ice water. There was no secret legal loophole to exploit. There was no reality television bailout coming to save them. Brad was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Valerie had just handed the FBI a recorded confession on a silver platter, and Marcus was staring down the barrel of a crippling IRS tax evasion sentence. They were cornered rats. Marcus realized that his arrogance had blinded him to the most obvious solution. He still foolishly believed he possessed a magnetic, irresistible charm. He convinced himself that 5 years of marriage could not just be erased by a single barbecue joke. He deluded himself into thinking that Simone was simply throwing a massive, elaborate tantrum to teach him a lesson about respect. And now that he was properly humbled, she would welcome him back into her protective financial embrace. He decided he needed to grovel. Marcus spent the next 3 hours hunched over his cracked laptop screen, desperately cross-referencing corporate public registries and commercial real estate filings. He tracked the newest subsidiary acquisitions under Simone Holdings LLC until he finally located the physical address of her primary executive headquarters. It was not a modest office space. It was the top 3 floors of a newly constructed, gleaming glass skyscraper located right in the most expensive commercial district of downtown Atlanta. Marcus dug through his black garbage bags to find the very last tailored suit he owned that was not completely destroyed. The fabric was hopelessly wrinkled, and the cuffs were fraying, but he put it on anyway. He had no sports cars left to drive, and he could not even afford a premium rideshare service. The former elite executive was forced to walk 3 blocks in the pouring rain to catch a public city bus. The sky over Atlanta had opened up into a violent, relentless downpour. Thunder rattled the concrete sidewalks as Marcus finally stepped off the bus and approached the towering glass skyscraper. He did not try to go inside. He knew the building's security would instantly throw him out the moment he approached the marble reception desk. He had to catch her outside in public, where she could not simply hit a button to have him removed. Marcus stood on the wet pavement near the grand revolving glass doors. The freezing rain plastered his expensive wrinkled shirt directly to his skin. The water ruined his leather shoes and soaked through his suit jacket, chilling him to the absolute bone. He stood there for 4 agonizing hours, shivering violently in the storm, ignoring the strange looks from passing corporate employees holding large umbrellas. He rehearsed his apologies over and over in his head. He practiced the exact facial expressions of a broken, deeply repentant man. He was ready to play the ultimate victim of his own family's toxic influence, ready to throw his mother and sister completely under the bus if it meant getting his platinum credit cards and his comfortable life back. Just as the streetlights began to flicker on against the darkening, stormy sky, the heavy glass revolving doors began to spin. Marcus pushed himself away from the concrete planter box, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. Simone emerged from the glowing lobby. She did not look like the quiet, submissive woman who used to shrink into the background while his family berated her. She looked like the absolute embodiment of untouchable corporate power. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored black trench coat that repelled the rain effortlessly. She was not alone. She was flanked by 4 massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors, wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces. One of the contractors held a large, heavy black umbrella directly over her head, shielding her entirely from the raging storm. Marcus stumbled forward, his wet shoes slapping loudly against the flooded pavement. The security contractors instantly reacted. 2 of the massive men stepped smoothly in front of Simone, forming an impenetrable human wall of muscle and dark fabric. They raised their hands, warning Marcus to step back immediately. Marcus did not care about the guards. He shoved his way forward and dramatically dropped to his wet knees, right there on the flooded Atlanta sidewalk. The dirty rain puddles immediately soaked through his suit trousers, staining the fabric dark. He looked up at the woman he had spent half a decade taking for granted. The streetlights illuminated his pathetic, soaking wet face. Tears of genuine desperation mixed seamlessly with the pouring rain sliding down his cheeks. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest. "I am sorry," Marcus screamed over the booming thunder, his voice cracking with raw, pathetic agony. "I see you now, Simone. I see everything they did to you. I was a coward, but I am a changed man. Please, I am begging you. I cannot survive without you." He stared up at her, holding his breath desperately, waiting for her eyes to soften. He waited for the hesitation, the lingering affection, the sudden realization that she still loved her husband. Simone stopped walking for a fraction of a second. She looked down at the shivering, weeping man kneeling in the dirty puddle at her expensive boots. There was absolutely no anger left in her eyes. There was no sadness. There was no lingering affection. There was only the freezing, absolute void of complete and utter indifference. She looked at him as if he were a discarded piece of trash blowing across the pavement. Simone did not reach out a hand to help him up. She did not yell at him for his past betrayals. She did not even address him directly. She simply turned her head slightly toward her lead security contractor. "Call the police," Simone said casually, her voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "There is a vagrant harassing my employees." Marcus did not even have the energy to fight back when the local Atlanta police officers roughly hauled him up from the dirty puddle. They slammed him against the side of a damp patrol car, reciting his Miranda rights while placing him under arrest for trespassing and public disturbance. He spent the entire night shivering in a crowded, freezing holding cell at the city precinct, surrounded by the exact type of people he used to mock from the comfort of his luxury sports cars. When he was finally released on his own recognizance the next morning, he had to walk 6 miles back to the cramped, moldy apartment because his transit card declined for a $2 bus fare. While Marcus was navigating the lowest point of his miserable existence, his brother-in-law was sitting in a completely different kind of hell. Brad was not in a chaotic local precinct. He was locked inside a sterile, soundproof federal interrogation room in downtown Atlanta. Brad was wearing a bright orange detention jumpsuit that clashed violently with his pale, terrified complexion. The arrogant, untouchable white financial broker who used to snatch Wagyu ribs off my plate was completely gone. In his place sat a trembling, sweating coward facing the absolute obliteration of his freedom. 2 veteran FBI agents walked into the freezing room and dropped a massive, heavily indexed binder onto the metal table. They did not offer him a coffee. They did not care about his former country club status. The lead agent opened the binder and began listing the precise, irrefutable evidence of Brad's extensive financial crimes. They had the emails I sent to his investors. They had the unredacted ledgers. They had a mountain of wire fraud charges, securities violations, and grand embezzlement counts. The agent looked Brad dead in the eye and informed him that the federal prosecutor was seeking a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. There would be no early parole. There would be no luxury minimum security camp. He was going to spend the best years of his life locked in a concrete box. Brad began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, tears of absolute panic spilling down his face. He begged the agents for a way out. He insisted he was a good person who just got carried away trying to provide for a demanding family. He cried that he was not a hardened criminal. The second agent leaned forward, resting his hands on the metal table. He told Brad that the federal government was always willing to listen if a suspect could provide bigger targets. They wanted to know exactly where the stolen millions went. They wanted the entire network. If Brad could offer up accomplices who benefited from the fraudulent enterprise, the prosecutor might be willing to discuss a significantly reduced sentence. Brad did not hesitate for a single second. Family loyalty meant absolutely nothing to a man staring down a 15-year prison sentence. He immediately threw his wife's entire family under the bus. Brad demanded a pen and a legal pad. He eagerly began writing down names, dates, and account numbers. He told the federal agents that he did not act alone. He spun a frantic, desperate narrative claiming that Marcus was fully aware of the illegal margin trading. He explained that Marcus willingly co-signed the fraudulent business loans to secure massive payouts for himself. Brad insisted that Marcus used the stolen investor funds to maintain the facade of a highly successful corporate executive. Then Brad turned his treacherous aim toward my former mother-in-law. He told the agents that Loretta was not just an innocent bystander enjoying the wealth of her children. He painted her as the greedy, demanding matriarch who actively pressured him to steal more money. Brad detailed how Loretta explicitly requested cuts of the embezzled cash to buy her designer wardrobes, fund her lavish estate parties, and project an image of pure generational wealth to the Atlanta elite. He gave the FBI the exact dates when Loretta demanded cash payouts to cover the maintenance of the Buckhead mansion. He insisted they were the true masterminds who drained his accounts and forced him to keep the Ponzi scheme running just to satisfy their insatiable appetite for status. The federal agents listened quietly, taking meticulous notes as Brad sang like a canary. He signed a sworn affidavit detailing every single luxury purchase his in-laws made using stolen federal funds. He traded his family for a plea deal without a shred of remorse. Marcus finally dragged himself up the concrete stairs of the decaying apartment complex, his wetsuit drying stiff and ruined against his skin. He unlocked the flimsy front door and stepped into the cramped living room. Loretta was pacing the stained carpet, clutching her chest, screaming at Valerie for failing to secure the reality television money. Valerie was curled into a ball on a cheap futon, rocking back and forth, entirely traumatized by her own self-inflicted legal disaster. Loretta turned her fury toward Marcus the second he walked in. She demanded to know where he had been all night. She shrieked that he was a useless failure of a son for not forcing me to restore their bank accounts. Marcus opened his mouth to explain the humiliation he had just endured outside my corporate headquarters. He never got the chance to speak. A deafening explosive crash echoed through the tiny apartment. The flimsy wooden front door was violently kicked entirely off its hinges. It splintered into pieces, crashing onto the cheap linoleum floor. A dozen heavily armed federal agents swarmed into the cramped living room, their tactical boots stomping over the debris. They aimed their weapons, shouting conflicting, terrifying commands. Valerie screamed, diving behind the cheap futon. Two massive agents grabbed Marcus by his ruined suit jacket. They slammed him face first against the peeling drywall. Marcus cried out in pain as they violently wrenched his arms behind his back, the cold steel handcuffs biting deeply into his wrists. He begged to know what was happening, sobbing that he had already been arrested once today. The lead federal agent stepped into the apartment holding a sheaf of federal warrants. He looked at Marcus with absolute disgust. He announced that Marcus was being federally indicted for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and criminal accessory to an illegal Ponzi scheme. Loretta backed against the tiny kitchen counter, clutching her pearls in sheer terror. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding the agents unhand her son, screaming about her pure bloodline and her innocent family. The lead agent simply turned to Loretta, his expression stone cold. He pulled a second warrant from his folder and looked the disgraced matriarch dead in the eye, informing her that she was next. The lead federal agent held the crisp white warrant inches from Loretta's face. The disgraced matriarch did not surrender. She resorted to the oldest, most manipulative trick in her extensive arsenal. Loretta clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes rolling dramatically into the back of her head. She let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, clawing at the collar of her silk blouse, as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked from the cramped apartment. She collapsed onto the stained linoleum floor, her body thrashing in a perfectly choreographed display of a massive cardiac event. The federal agents instantly stepped back, their tactical training superseded by strict medical protocol. The lead agent cursed under his breath and immediately radioed for an emergency medical evacuation. Loretta was loaded onto a stretcher and oxygen mask strapped over her face, successfully stalling her federal indictment. An hour later, Loretta lay in a sterile, harsh triage bed at a notoriously underfunded Atlanta County hospital. This was not the luxury private clinic she was accustomed to. The sheets were scratchy, the fluorescent lights buzzed obnoxiously, and 2 federal marshals were stationed firmly right outside her thin curtain. She needed a transfer to a luxury suite immediately, and she needed cash to orchestrate a high-powered legal defense. Loretta spotted a young, overworked nursing assistant checking vitals in the next bay. Using her classic tearful manipulation, Loretta convinced the young woman to lend her a personal cell phone for one emergency family call. The moment the nurse stepped away, Loretta dialed the direct unlisted number for my secure offshore line. She knew I would monitor the incoming call. I was sitting in my glass-walled office overlooking the Atlanta skyline when the burner number flashed across my screen. I answered the call, remaining entirely silent. Simone. Loretta gasped into the receiver, her voice incredibly weak and trembling with manufactured agony. "Simone, please listen to me. I am dying. The doctors say my heart is failing rapidly. They have me trapped in this disgusting state facility surrounded by common criminals. Please, I know we had our minor differences, but I am your family. You cannot let me die in the gutter like a stray animal. Pay for my transfer to the Piedmont VIP suite. Have some Christian mercy and pay my medical bills before it is too late." I listened to the desperate, oscillating pitch of her voice. She was incredibly convincing. If I had been the same naive, desperate woman from 5 years ago, I might have felt a profound twinge of guilt. I might have authorized a multi-thousand-dollar transfer to save my mother-in-law. But I was the senior risk analyst who knew every single financial and medical skeleton buried in her designer closet. I did not speak a single word. I simply ended the call. My fingers flew across my dual-illuminated keyboards. I bypassed the county hospital's outdated firewall in less than 60 seconds. I located the attending physician assigned to Loretta's triage bay. I did not just send him a standard email. I sent him a meticulously documented, highly cross-referenced medical and financial dossier. I compiled 5 years of Loretta's insurance claims and billing codes. I highlighted the exact dates she had miraculously suffered debilitating health crises right whenever a massive financial obligation loomed. I attached the medical report from 3 years ago when she faked a severe stroke to avoid a mandatory financial audit from the church board. I attached the emergency room bill from 2 years ago when she feigned sudden cardiac palpitations to get out of paying a high-end landscaping contractor. I provided absolute, undeniable proof that the woman currently taking up a critical trauma bed was perfectly healthy and actively executing a medical fraud scheme to evade federal arrest. I flagged the email as a priority security alert and sent it directly to the chief of medicine, the attending physician, and the hospital's legal billing department simultaneously. Back in the sterile triage bay, Loretta adjusted her plastic oxygen mask, smiling smugly to herself. She firmly believed her aggressive guilt trip had worked. She fully expected a team of private transport medics to burst through the swinging doors at any moment to whisk her away to a high thread count recovery suite. Instead, the heavy curtain was aggressively yanked open by the stern, unsmiling attending physician. He was flanked by the hospital's shift supervisor and a grim-faced billing administrator. He did not ask Loretta about her chest pain. He did not check her vital signs. He reached down and efficiently ripped the sticky EKG monitor pads directly off her chest. Loretta let out a shocked, indignant screech, demanding to know what he was doing to a critically ill woman. The doctor stared at her with absolute disgust. He held up a printed copy of the comprehensive dossier I had just emailed him. He informed Loretta that her blood work was pristine, her heart rhythm was perfect, and her historical pattern of staging medical emergencies to avoid legal accountability was now fully documented in their hospital system. He told her she was taking up a bed that a genuine trauma victim desperately needed. He ordered her to get out of his emergency room immediately. Loretta tried to argue, clutching her chest again, but the doctor was entirely unmoved. He pointed a firm finger toward the exit. The billing administrator stepped forward and slapped a bright yellow invoice onto Loretta's lap. The administrator stated clearly that Loretta was being charged a massive premium for a fraudulent emergency room visit, utilizing scarce public medical resources under false pretenses. The exorbitant bill was being immediately sent to collections. Loretta was forced to strip off the scratchy hospital gown and put her damp, ruined designer clothes back on. She was trembling not from a heart attack, but from the sheer, humiliating realization that I had anticipated her every move and blocked her only escape route. She had no money, no leverage, and no luxurious hospital bed to hide in. She clutched the heavy medical bill in her shaking hands and shuffled slowly out of the triage bay. She pushed open the heavy double doors of the emergency room, expecting to step out into the humid Atlanta night to figure out a new desperate plan. The cold night air hit her face, but she could not take a single step forward. The two federal marshals were standing squarely on the concrete loading dock, their heavy steel handcuffs gleaming brightly under the harsh emergency room floodlights, waiting patiently to escort the disgraced matriarch directly to a federal holding cell. Exactly 364 days had passed since the infamous summer barbecue. The sweltering Atlanta heat baked the roof of the decaying apartment complex where Marcus, Valerie, and Loretta now lived. There were no infinity pools here. There were no imported steaks or crystal champagne flutes. There was only the heavy, suffocating stench of cheap instant noodles and the relentless hum of a broken window air conditioning unit that leaked murky water onto the stained linoleum floor. Marcus sat at the wobbly kitchen table, staring blankly at a wall calendar. Tomorrow marked the exact one-year anniversary of the day his wife vanished and took his entire universe with her. He ran a trembling hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. His tailored suits were long gone, sold off months ago to pay for low-tier defense attorneys who treated him with blatant disrespect. He wore a faded, stretched-out cotton shirt. Spread across the sticky table in front of him was their new reality. A stack of final eviction warnings, a thick pile of federal court summons, and a bright blue electronic benefit transfer card. Food stamps. The former corporate executive, who used to sneer at the working class, was now entirely dependent on government assistance just to buy bread. The flimsy front door rattled violently before swinging open. Valerie marched inside, kicking off her cheap waterlogged sneakers. She was still wearing the hideous neon green polyester uniform from the fast fashion mall store. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken with chronic exhaustion and bitter resentment. She threw her counterfeit handbag onto the kitchen counter and let out a frustrated scream. She had just spent another grueling 9-hour shift being mocked by teenagers who remembered her viral tearful collapse on the sidewalk outside her locked cosmetics warehouse. Valerie demanded to know if Marcus had secured the money for her legal retainer. Her public defender had bluntly informed her that morning that the federal prosecutor was pushing for a harsh sentence regarding her fraudulent loan applications. Brad was already sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting his own sentencing, having happily traded his new family for a lighter plea deal. Valerie was utterly terrified. She screamed at Marcus, blaming his cowardice and his inability to control his wife for her impending prison sentence. Marcus slammed his fist down on the table, silencing his sister. He shoved a crumpled, water-stained copy of a local Atlanta business journal across the laminate surface. He told Valerie to stop acting like a victim and read the front page. Valerie snatched the newspaper, her manicured nails long replaced by chipped, uneven polish. The bold headline grabbed her attention immediately. It announced the highly anticipated Atlanta Elite Philanthropy Gala scheduled for the following evening at the prestigious Biltmore Ballrooms. The front-page article detailed how a mysterious, incredibly wealthy billionaire investor was hosting the extravagant event. The anonymous benefactor was slated to award $10 million in private grants to local families and business owners who had fallen on catastrophic hard times. The bedroom door creaked open. Loretta shuffled into the cramped living area. The disgraced matriarch was a shadow of her former intimidating self. She wore a faded bathrobe, and a bulky black GPS ankle monitor was strapped tightly around her left leg, courtesy of her pending federal embezzlement charges. She had heard the desperation in Marcus's voice. She snatched the newspaper from Valerie's hands, her eyes scanning the details of the $10 million grant. A terrifying, delusional spark reignited in Loretta's eyes. She slapped the newspaper back onto the table. She declared that this mysterious billionaire was their divine salvation. She insisted that the universe was finally recognizing their suffering and preparing to restore their pure bloodline to its rightful throne. Loretta commanded her son and daughter to attend the gala. She told them they needed to corner the anonymous billionaire, pitch their tragic story of being viciously sabotaged by a jealous lower-class outsider, and walk away with a multi-million-dollar bailout check. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, pointing out the obvious flaw in his mother's manic plan. The Atlanta Elite Philanthropy Gala was the most exclusive, heavily guarded social event of the year. They were completely blacklisted from high society. They had no invitations. They had no security clearance. Most importantly, they had absolutely nothing appropriate to wear. Valerie's eyes darkened with reckless, desperate ambition. She looked at the blue food stamp card sitting on the table, then back to the newspaper. She stated coldly that she would rather die in federal prison than spend another day ringing up clearance rack clothing. She promised Marcus she would get them inside that ballroom. That afternoon, Valerie walked into a high-end department store in the affluent Buckhead district, the very neighborhood they had been violently evicted from. She kept her head down, dodging the gaze of the security guards. She grabbed a breathtaking floor-length emerald silk gown and slipped into the fitting room. Her hands shook as she used a smuggled pair of wire cutters to meticulously snap the thick plastic security tags. She stuffed the expensive gown into a foil-lined shopping bag designed to bypass the door alarms. She walked straight out the front doors, her heart hammering against her ribs, committing yet another felony just to maintain a sliver of her fake elite illusion. Marcus swallowed the very last shred of his pride. He took the public bus to a discount thrift store on the poor side of the city. He spent his very final $20 on a poorly fitting, slightly stained black tuxedo jacket and a pair of scuffed dress shoes. He stood in the narrow, flickering mirror of the thrift store, disgusted by his own reflection, but fueled by the desperate hope of a miraculous financial rescue. The next evening, the damp Atlanta air hung heavy over the brilliantly illuminated Biltmore ballrooms. Marcus and Valerie stood shivering in the dark alleyway near the service entrance. Valerie looked stunning in her stolen emerald gown, though the stolen fabric felt heavy with impending doom. Marcus adjusted his cheap, tight collar, sweating profusely, despite the cool night breeze. They silently watched the city's most powerful politicians, wealthy socialites, and elite business owners exit their sleek black limousines and glide past the velvet ropes. They waited for the catering staff to prop open the heavy steel kitchen doors for a delivery. Marcus grabbed Valerie's hand. They slipped through the shadows, dodging waiters and busboys, sneaking past the service corridors, and pushing their way toward the grand chandelier-lit ballroom. They were completely blinded by their own greed and desperation. They believed they were about to secure a $10 million miracle. They had absolutely no idea at all they were walking directly into a meticulously engineered, inescapable slaughter. Marcus and Valerie pressed their backs against the cold plaster of the service corridor, holding their breath as a pair of armed security guards marched past the swinging kitchen doors. The moment the heavy boots faded down the hall, Valerie grabbed her brother by his cheap lapels and yanked him toward the shimmering velvet curtains that separated the service area from the grand ballroom. They slipped through the heavy fabric, instantly assaulted by the overwhelming fragrance of imported orchids and the deafening hum of classical string music. The Biltmore ballrooms had been transformed into an absolute fortress of extreme wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of Atlanta's most powerful political figures, real estate tycoons, and corporate moguls. Valerie smoothed down the stolen emerald silk gown, desperately hoping the dim lighting would mask the jagged frayed seam where she had frantically clipped off the security tag. Marcus tugged at his thrift store tuxedo collar, feeling the rough synthetic fabric scraping against his sweating neck. He stood up straight, plastering on the arrogant, charismatic smile he used to wear effortlessly. He genuinely believed that if he could just get a glass of champagne in his hand and find the right circle of investors, he could charm his way back into the elite echelon. They grabbed 2 flutes of champagne from a passing waiter and waded into the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Marcus immediately spotted a group of commercial real estate developers he used to play golf with at the Buckhead Country Club. He marched right up to them, slapping a tall, broad-shouldered man on the back with forced familiarity. The group of wealthy men turned around. The polite smiles vanished from their faces the absolute second they recognized Marcus. The tall developer looked down at Marcus's scuffed second-hand dress shoes, then back up to his sweating, desperate face. He did not say hello. He did not offer a handshake. He simply turned his back, signaling the rest of the circle to physically close ranks, creating an impenetrable wall of broad shoulders that completely iced Marcus out of the conversation. Valerie was experiencing her own brutal public execution across the room. She spotted a prominent beauty brand owner she used to collaborate with online. Valerie rushed over, projecting her fake, high-pitched influencer squeal, acting as if the entire warehouse padlock incident was just a minor legal misunderstanding. The beauty mogul did not smile. She took 2 deliberate steps backward, holding her designer clutch tightly against her chest, as if Valerie were carrying a highly contagious disease. The beauty mogul looked at Valerie up and down with sheer, unadulterated disgust. She told Valerie that the entire socialite community had watched her viral, unhinged meltdown outside her confiscated warehouse. She coldly advised Valerie to leave the premises before she called security to have her arrested for trespassing, noting loudly that the emerald dress Valerie was wearing looked suspiciously identical to the ones reported stolen from a high-end boutique in Buckhead that very morning. Valerie felt her face burn with catastrophic humiliation. She backed away, retreating into the shadows of a towering floral arrangement. Marcus found his sister hiding behind the orchids. His false confidence was entirely shattered. Every single person they approached had treated them like toxic waste. They were absolute pariahs. No one wanted to be associated with a family currently under multiple federal fraud indictments. Marcus grabbed Valerie's arm, his grip tight with panic. He whispered frantically that their only remaining option was to find the anonymous billionaire, secure the $10 million grant, and escape the city tonight. They huddled together near the grand staircase, eavesdropping on the hushed, reverent conversations happening among the elite guests. Everyone was whispering about the mysterious guest of honor. Marcus leaned in, straining to hear a group of banking executives discussing the anonymous benefactor. The executives were speaking with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. They talked about a ruthless, brilliant financial phantom who had descended upon the Atlanta market out of nowhere exactly a year ago. They whispered that this woman was a terrifying data genius who had single-handedly audited, exposed, and entirely destroyed 3 separate fraudulent hedge funds in the past 12 months. They marveled at how she systematically liquidated corrupt portfolios, donating the seized assets to local charities and marginalized communities. They called her the silent executioner of the financial district. Marcus and Valerie exchanged a look of pure, desperate greed. They completely missed the glaring, obvious red flags. They did not connect the timeline. They did not process the financial auditing background. They simply heard the words, "ruthless billionaire," and saw a giant golden ticket out of their cramped, moldy apartment. Marcus adjusted his cheap tie, telling Valerie to get ready to cry on command. They were going to throw themselves at the feet of this financial executioner and beg for financial salvation. Suddenly, the gentle classical music cut out entirely. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead slowly dimmed, casting the sprawling ballroom into a dramatic, expectant twilight. A single piercing white spotlight hit the center of the grand marble stage. The dull roar of the elite crowd instantly silenced. The mayor of Atlanta stepped out from behind the velvet curtains and walked briskly up to the golden microphone. He adjusted his suit, looking out over the sea of the city's most powerful citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, the mayor announced, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. Tonight we are gathered to honor a woman who has completely redefined the economic landscape of our great city. She is a visionary. She is a protector of the vulnerable. She is the brilliant architect who purged the corruption from our financial sector and brought accountability back to Atlanta. Marcus nudged Valerie, his heart hammering wildly with anticipation. He was ready to sprint to the front of the stage the moment the woman appeared. It is my profound honor to finally introduce our anonymous benefactor. The mayor continued, raising his hand toward the top of the grand staircase. Please welcome the savior of our local economy, the chief executive officer of Wallpaper LLC. Marcus froze. The breath was violently sucked straight out of his lungs. Valerie dropped her stolen champagne flute onto the marble floor. The glass shattered into 100 pieces, but the sound was entirely drowned out by the deafening, thunderous applause rapidly erupting all around them. The heavy crimson velvet curtains parted with a slow, dramatic sweep. Simone stepped out into the blinding white spotlight. The entire Biltmore ballroom seemed to collectively hold its breath before the applause surged into a deafening roar. She did not look like the quiet, submissive woman who used to stand in the corner of Loretta's patio. She looked like a conqueror. She wore a breathtaking custom-made gown of deep sapphire blue, the silk cascading around her like liquid sapphire. The dress was a masterclass in aggressive elegance, structured with sharp architectural lines that projected absolute, unapologetic authority. Diamonds caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers sparkling at her collarbone and wrists, but they paled in comparison to the sheer, terrifying confidence radiating from her eyes. Marcus stood paralyzed near the grand staircase. His cheap thrift store tuxedo suddenly felt like a straitjacket woven from barbed wire. His chest heaved as he fought for oxygen. His brain violently rejected the visual information his eyes were processing. He blinked rapidly, desperately hoping the lighting was playing a cruel trick on him. He expected to see a stranger, a faceless corporate titan, a legendary billionaire who would hand him a bailout check. Instead, he saw the wife he had verbally abused, financially exploited, and completely discarded for the sake of his mother's toxic approval. Valerie was hyperventilating beside him. She stared at the broken shards of crystal from her dropped champagne flute on the polished marble floor, then slowly looked back up at the stage. The horrific, paralyzing truth slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The silent executioner of the financial district. The ruthless billionaire who dismantled 3 fraudulent hedge funds. The anonymous benefactor handing out $10 million grants. It was all Simone. Every single devastating catastrophe that had systematically dismantled their pure bloodline over the past 12 months was not a streak of incredibly bad luck. It was a perfectly executed, flawless financial slaughter, engineered by the very woman Valerie had called invisible. The mayor of Atlanta stepped back, bowing his head in genuine, profound respect as Simone approached the golden microphone. The applause from the city's most powerful politicians and corporate moguls finally began to settle, replaced by an awed, expectant silence. These billionaires and real estate tycoons were looking at Simone with absolute reverence. They hung on her every movement. Marcus watched the men who had just shunned him a few minutes ago, now gazing at his former wife, as if she held the keys to the entire city. Simone adjusted the microphone stand. She did not tap the mic. She did not ask for their attention. She simply commanded it. Her voice flowed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, calm, melodic, and laced with lethal precision. Good evening, Atlanta. Simone began, her gaze sweeping smoothly over the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. 1 year ago, I made a decision to step out of the shadows. I realized that this beautiful city was being suffocated by parasites. I saw individuals masquerading as elite business leaders, hiding their massive debts behind leased sports cars and stolen charity funds. I decided it was time to clean house. Every single word felt like a physical strike against Marcus and Valerie. They stood shivering in the dark periphery of the ballroom, completely trapped. Valerie gripped her stolen emerald dress, her knuckles turning white. She recalled the brutal federal indictment her husband Brad was currently facing. She remembered the padlock on her cosmetics warehouse. She remembered the undercover reality television producer who tricked her into a recorded confession. Simone had choreographed every single downfall with surgical accuracy. She had not just beaten them. She had completely rewritten the rules of the game and then burned the board to ash. I founded Wallpaper LLC with a very specific mission. Simone continued, a razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. Sometimes people look right past the foundational structures that hold their entire lives together. They treat the people carrying their burdens as if they are merely part of the background scenery. They call them wallpaper. But the danger of ignoring the foundation is that when the foundation decides to move, the entire house collapses into rubble. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause again, completely unaware of the deeply personal, brutal double meaning behind her speech. They thought she was delivering a brilliant corporate metaphor about market disruption. Marcus knew the truth. She was publicly dissecting his ruined family in front of the entire upper echelon of Georgia society, and they were cheering for her. Marcus felt a violent, toxic cocktail of shame, entitlement, and sheer delusion bubbling up in his chest. His fragile, narcissistic ego could not comprehend the reality of the situation. He could not accept that he was a broke, desperate man wearing a stained jacket, while his former wife was a billionaire philanthropist commanding the city's elite. In his twisted, desperate mind, he still believed he owned her. He still believed that because they had stood at an altar, her massive fortune somehow rightfully belonged to him. He convinced himself that if he just confronted her right now, if he exposed their connection to the wealthy crowd, the power dynamic would instantly shift back into his favor. He forgot about the post-nuptial agreement. He forgot about his federal tax evasion charges. He forgot that she had literally handed him his own destruction. Marcus let out a feral, guttural roar. He shoved Valerie aside, nearly knocking his sister into a towering floral arrangement. He bolted from the shadows of the service corridor, sprinting directly into the illuminated center of the grand ballroom. He wildly shoved a prominent banking executive out of his way, tearing through the crowd of horrified socialites. He charged toward the marble steps of the stage, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at the woman bathed in the blinding white spotlight. The elegant, classical ambiance of the gala shattered instantly as his frantic voice echoed off the high, gilded ceilings. "That is my wife," Marcus screamed at the top of his lungs, his eyes wide and manic as he tried to scramble up the velvet-lined stairs. "You are all clapping for a thief. She stole my money. That is my wife, and she stole everything from me." Two of my lead security contractors did not even give Marcus the chance to touch the first velvet-lined step. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. A man who weighed 250 pounds of pure muscle tackled my ex-husband squarely in the center of his chest. The impact sounded like a car crash. Marcus was violently thrown backward, his cheap thrift store tuxedo ripping loudly at the shoulder seam as he slammed face first onto the polished marble floor. The heavy thud of his skull bouncing against the stone echoed through the cavernous Biltmore ballroom. The second security guard immediately dropped his knee directly into the center of Marcus's spine, pinning him to the ground while twisting his arms sharply behind his back. Marcus gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against the freezing marble. He thrashed like a caught fish, spitting blood from a busted lip onto the pristine floor, still trying to scream that I belonged to him. He demanded that the mayor arrest me. He demanded that the wealthy crowd help him. The elite society of Atlanta did not rush to his aid. They did the exact opposite. The sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns stepped backward in perfect unison, forming a massive empty circle of sheer revulsion around my ex-husband. Billionaire investors, prominent politicians, and powerful socialites looked down at Marcus with absolute disgust. They recognized him immediately. The whispers rippled through the ballroom like wildfire. They pointed at his scuffed shoes. They pointed at his ripped, stained jacket. They sneered at the disgraced son of the corrupt, embezzling church board member. He was a spectacular, pathetic failure bleeding on their shoes, and they looked at him as if he were a diseased rat that had scurried in from the street. Valerie watched her brother get pinned to the floor. The delusional reality she had constructed completely shattered. She shrieked Marcus's name at the top of her lungs, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the elegant ambiance of the gala. She completely forgot where she was. She forgot the stolen emerald gown she was wearing. She bolted from the shadows of the floral arrangement, sprinting blindly across the ballroom to save him. She only made it 4 steps. The raw, frayed hem of the stolen silk gown caught violently under the heel of her scuffed pump. Valerie pitched forward, her arms flailing wildly in the air as she lost her balance. She let out a horrifying screech as she plummeted head-first toward a passing catering waiter. The waiter was carrying a massive, towering silver tray stacked high with hundreds of crystal champagne flutes. Valerie crashed directly into him with the force of a bowling ball. The sound of the collision was deafening. The massive silver tray flipped into the air. Hundreds of delicate crystal glasses rained down, shattering explosively across the marble floor. A torrential downpour of expensive sticky champagne completely drenched Valerie from head to toe. She hit the ground hard, skidding across the slippery, wet marble and landing in a tangled, pathetic heap of stolen green silk and broken glass. The entire ballroom gasped in collective horror. Valerie lay on her back, covered in sticky alcohol, her cheap knockoff handbag spilling its contents across the floor. A tube of discount lipstick and a handful of crumpled food stamp receipts scattered directly at the feet of a prominent real estate mogul. Valerie tried to push herself up, but a sharp piece of broken crystal sliced into the palm of her hand. She cried out, cradling her bleeding hand against her chest. The emerald gown, soaking wet and ripped, clung to her body, completely exposing the jagged missing security tag sensor hole to the entire room of wealthy elites. The beauty brand owner, who had shunned Valerie earlier, pointed directly at the torn fabric. She announced loudly to the surrounding crowd that the dress was stolen merchandise from a boutique in Buckhead. The disgusted whispers grew louder, transforming into open, outright mockery. Valerie sat in the puddle of champagne and broken glass, sobbing uncontrollably. The luxury influencer, who used to brag about her flawless aesthetic, was now a bleeding, soaking wet, publicly humiliated shoplifter crying on the floor of a billionaire gala. Marcus continued to writhe under the heavy knee of my security contractor. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor and craned his neck to look up at me. He screamed my name, his voice hoarse and raw. He demanded I tell my guards to let him go. He commanded me to obey him, still completely trapped in the delusion that he held any power over my life. I stood perfectly still at the center of the illuminated stage. I looked down at the 2 pathetic figures thrashing in the debris of their own making. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel guilt. I felt the absolute intoxicating rush of total victory. They had tried to bury me alive for 5 years. Now they were drowning in a shallow puddle of their own toxic entitlement. I raised a single diamond-adorned hand. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. My lead security contractor saw the signal and instantly froze. He eased the crushing pressure off Marcus's spine, just enough to let him breathe, but kept his arms firmly locked. The entire ballroom fell dead silent. The mayor stepped back, giving me the floor. The powerful investors watched me with bated breath, waiting to see how the silent executioner of the financial district would handle this public disturbance. I gripped the golden microphone in my right hand. I did not ask for assistance. I did not look away. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. My custom sapphire heels clicked sharply against the marble stairs of the stage. The sound echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting through the silence like a metronome, counting down to their final destruction. I descended the stairs with predatory grace. The sea of wealthy socialites parted for me instantly, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly to the center of the chaos. I walked past the gaping politicians. I walked past the staring corporate moguls. I kept my eyes locked dead onto my ex-husband and his sobbing sister. I stepped carefully over the shattered crystal glass, my sapphire silk gown gliding smoothly over the polished floor. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from Marcus's bleeding face and Valerie's trembling, soaking wet body. Marcus looked up at me, his chest heaving. The sheer terror finally began to replace the rage in his bloodshot eyes. He saw the cold, unyielding reality written across my face. He saw that the woman he was looking at was a stranger. The submissive, quiet wife he had financially exploited and emotionally battered was completely dead. She had died the night of the barbecue. The woman standing above him was a billionaire titan who held his entire future in the palm of her hand. Valerie whimpered, curling into a tighter ball among the broken glass, trying desperately to hide her face from the flashing cameras of the local news crews who were covering the charity event. The bright lights illuminated her ruined, stolen dress and her bleeding hand. I stood above them, a towering monument of retribution. I adjusted my grip on the microphone, the heavy gold metal cold against my palm. I looked down at the family that had tried to erase me. I prepared to deliver the final fatal strike. Marcus choked on a mix of blood and saliva, his cheek pressed flat against the freezing marble. He strained his neck to look up at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. He expected me to scream. He expected a dramatic, emotional outburst from a scorned woman finally getting her revenge. He expected me to show some sign that he still mattered, even if that sign was pure hatred. But as I stared down at him, my expression remained completely hollow. There was no anger left in my veins. There was no lingering pain. There was only the absolute chilling indifference of a titan observing an insect. I did not see my husband. I saw a failed investment that I had decisively liquidated. Valerie let out a pathetic whimper from the floor nearby. She was clutching her bleeding palm, shivering violently in her soaked, stolen emerald silk gown. The cheap, jagged hole where she had violently ripped out the security tag was exposed for every single billionaire politician and socialite in the ballroom to witness. The elite society of Atlanta stood perfectly still, their breath collectively held, forming a massive, silent coliseum around us. A terrified catering waiter trembling so badly that the crystal flutes on his silver tray rattled together took a hesitant step forward. He did not know what to do. I did not break eye contact with my ex-husband. I simply reached out my left hand. The waiter hurried forward and carefully placed a pristine, chilled glass of champagne between my diamond-adorned fingers. He immediately scurried back into the shadows of the velvet curtains. Marcus tried to thrash against the weight of the security contractor kneeling on his spine. He spat a streak of crimson onto the floor and tried to command the room. He screamed that I was legally obligated to share this wealth. He yelled that he was entitled to half of my holding company, blindly clinging to the delusional arrogance that had defined his entire pathetic existence. I raised the golden microphone to my lips. I did not shout over him. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that instantly amplified through the massive surround sound system, drowning out his pathetic cries. "You own absolutely nothing, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing off the high gilded ceilings like a gavel striking wood. "You signed away your rights the day you traded your pride for a bailout. You thought you were outsmarting a naive working-class girl. You did not realize you were signing a legally binding surrender to the woman who controlled every single digit in your fraudulent bank accounts." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, a raw, humiliating sob finally ripping through his chest. The reality of his complete destruction was no longer avoidable. I turned my gaze slowly away from him. I looked down at Valerie. The former luxury influencer shrank back against the broken glass, trying desperately to cover her face with her uninjured hand to shield herself from the flashing cameras of the local press. She was a ruined, sticky mess of cheap champagne, stolen fabric, and absolute public disgrace. I stepped closer to her, the hem of my custom sapphire gown brushing against the shattered crystal. I looked down at her shivering, pathetic frame. I held up the crystal champagne glass. The brilliant light from the massive chandeliers overhead caught the sparkling liquid, reflecting a blinding golden glow across the ballroom. The gesture was a perfect, deliberate mirror of the exact moment she had initiated her own downfall 1 year ago. Valerie saw the glass. Her bloodshot mascara-stained eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. She finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. She finally realized that every single catastrophe of the past year, the padlocked warehouse, the federal cease and desist order, the undercover reality television trap that caught her confessing to wire fraud, was all part of a meticulously engineered symphony of my retaliation. The silence in the grand hall was absolute. The city's most powerful moguls watched in awe as I prepared to deliver the final strike. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet, intoxicating scent of my own total liberation. The entire power structure of the Atlanta elite was hanging on my next breath. The people who once ignored my existence were now entirely captivated by my presence. "Valerie, a year ago you made a joke," I said into the microphone, my voice perfectly steady, slicing through the heavy, expectant air. "We were standing in the sunlight of a mansion you no longer own. You clinked your champagne glass, demanding the attention of people who no longer speak your name. You looked me directly in the eye, and you said if I disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." Valerie let out a strangled, breathless choke. She shook her head violently, tears of pure, unvarnished regret pouring down her cheeks, washing away the last remnants of her fake, arrogant facade. "You told everyone I was irrelevant." I continued, taking a slow, measured step closer to her cowering form. "You told your family I was a burden. You told your brother to ignore me. You called me invisible. You called me wallpaper." I paused, letting the heavy, devastating weight of my words settle over the hundreds of elite guests. I looked at the mayor. I looked at the prominent banking executives whose fraudulent competitors I had systematically dismantled. I looked back down at the two shivering, broken people bleeding on the marble floor. "But look at us now," I said, my voice dropping into a chilling, triumphant whisper that commanded the entire room. Marcus let out another agonizing sob, his face pressed against the cold stone. Valerie curled into a tight, miserable ball, completely broken by the brutal, undeniable truth of her reality. I smiled softly. "I disappeared and I became a legend. You are standing right in front of me screaming and literally no one cares. Who is the wallpaper now?" I let the heavy golden microphone drop from my hand. It hit the polished marble floor with a loud, sharp thud that echoed like a final gavel strike through the cavernous ballroom. I did not wait for Marcus to formulate another pathetic excuse. I did not wait for Valerie to beg for mercy. I simply raised my right hand and gave my lead security contractor a single definitive nod. The massive men in dark suits moved with terrifying efficiency. They hauled Marcus up from the floor by the collar of his ruined, cheap tuxedo. He thrashed violently, kicking his scuffed dress shoes against the marble, but his resistance was utterly useless against their sheer physical power. A second pair of guards hoisted Valerie to her feet. She was a sticky, bleeding mess of cheap champagne and stolen emerald silk. She shrieked, desperately reaching her uninjured hand toward the wealthy socialites and powerful politicians she used to call her peers. She begged the prominent beauty brand owners and real estate moguls to intervene to save her from this public execution. The elite society of Atlanta did not move a single inch to help her. They stood perfectly still, their faces frozen in masks of absolute chilling disgust. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path to the grand exit. My security detail dragged my ex-husband and his sister straight through the center of the glittering ballroom. Marcus sobbed uncontrollably, his tears mixing with the blood on his chin, screaming my name over and over again until his voice cracked into a hoarse, pathetic rasp. Valerie wailed, her bare feet dragging through the shattered crystal glass of her own making. The heavy brass doors of the Biltmore ballrooms were shoved open. The guards hurled them both out into the freezing, relentless Atlanta rain. Marcus slammed hard onto the wet concrete of the service alley. Valerie tumbled down beside him, the stolen dress tearing entirely up the side. The heavy brass doors slammed shut, locking them out in the cold, brutal darkness. They were permanently exiled from the society they worshipped. They were left to drown in the torrential storm with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their impending prison sentences and inescapable poverty. The structural collapse of their fake empire happened with breathtaking speed. The federal justice system did not care about their pure bloodline. Brad sat in a sterile federal courtroom 3 weeks later looking utterly defeated in his orange detention uniform. His arrogant white privilege had completely evaporated the moment the judge rejected his initial bail request. To avoid a brutal trial, Brad accepted a massive plea deal. He was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He traded his tailored suits and country club memberships for a concrete cell and a metal toilet. Loretta never recovered from the sheer humiliation of her public exposure. The state attorney general formally charged her with grand embezzlement from the mega-church charity fund. With her Buckhead mansion auctioned off and her bank accounts frozen by my forensic audits, she could not afford a private defense attorney. Her fake heart attack stunt backfired spectacularly. The court deemed her a severe flight risk with deep psychological instability. The disgraced matriarch was stripped of her designer clothes and her signature pearls. She was remanded to a drab, underfunded state-run medical and psychiatric facility pending her criminal trial. She spent her days sitting in a plastic chair in a sterile common room, completely isolated. None of her former high society friends ever came to visit her. Valerie faced her own devastating federal wire fraud indictment. The high-definition video confession I secured through the fake reality television producer was airtight. The judge showed zero leniency for a woman who stole federal relief funds to buy luxury cars while claiming to be a self-made entrepreneur. Valerie was stripped of her smartphone, her social media accounts, and her fake influencer identity. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, her glamorous lifestyle permanently replaced by institutional routine and absolute irrelevance. Marcus experienced the most humiliating fate of them all. He managed to avoid a federal prison sentence for his involvement in Brad's Ponzi scheme by liquidating every single asset he had ever touched and fully cooperating with the IRS. But avoiding prison did not mean he was free. The federal government garnished 90% of his wages to pay down the staggering $1.2 million tax evasion debt. Stripped of his corporate title and completely blacklisted from the Atlanta business sector, Marcus had only one employment option left. The former elite executive took a minimum wage job working the graveyard shift as a commercial janitor. Every night, he pushed a heavy yellow mop bucket through the very same downtown corporate high-rises he used to strut through. He scrubbed toilets and emptied trash cans to pay off a monumental debt that would outlive him, entirely trapped in a cycle of exhausting, backbreaking poverty. I did not watch their trials. I did not read the sensational local news articles detailing their spectacular downfall. I was entirely finished with them. I walked into my sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. The space was an absolute sanctuary of quiet, modern elegance. There were no manipulative mother-in-laws demanding obedience. There were no cowardly husbands gambling away my peace. The air was clean, calm, and perfectly still. I set my designer handbag on the marble kitchen island and walked over to my home office. I opened my encrypted laptop, the screen illuminating the dark room. I spent 20 minutes reviewing a new set of data for a massive commercial real estate acquisition. The numbers were flawless. My holding company was expanding exponentially, solidifying my position as one of the most powerful financial forces in the entire state. I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive click. I walked back to the kitchen and selected a bottle of extremely rare imported red wine from my climate-controlled cellar. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass, the deep ruby liquid catching the soft ambient light of the penthouse. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The vibrant, sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out beneath me, an ocean of brilliant lights pulsing with endless opportunity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It tasted like absolute, unadulterated victory. The revenge was completely finalized. The years of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation were permanently purged from my soul. I had not just survived their toxic cruelty, I had utterly erased them from the map. I looked out over the empire I had built with my own hands. A slow, triumphant, and deeply peaceful smile spread across my face. The darkness of the past was gone forever, and the bright, limitless future belonged entirely to me. The lesson. The ultimate lesson from Simone's journey is that true power doesn't require a megaphone. It requires meticulous preparation and unshakable self-worth. Toxic people often mistake silence for weakness and patience for permanent compliance. When you are the foundational architect of your own life, you do not need to beg for respect at a table where you are perpetually undervalued. Instead, you quietly build your own empire, sever the financial and emotional ties that drain you, and let their own arrogance become the architect of their downfall. Never let anyone treat you like wallpaper when you own the entire house. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to reclaim your power, and tell us in the comments below. How did you finally walk away from toxic disrespect?